Hello, fellow sapiens. Whether you're winding down before bed or drifting through the day with headphones on, welcome. You've just found a quiet place to rest your mind. This is Sleepless Homo, slow, factual storytelling for the tired primate who still can't stop thinking about deep time, lost lands, and how we got here. So wherever you are, in bed, in traffic, cooking, showering, or just working quietly, this is your invitation to slow down, to sink into the calm rhythm of real history. If you find yourself learning something, or simply enjoying the way this story unfolds, consider tapping like and subscribing. That small action helps this kind of long-form, science-based content reach more people who might need a different way to learn. The quiet way, the curious way. And if you're willing to share, drop a comment and tell us, do you use this to fall asleep or focus while working? What time and place are you listening from? We'd love to know what kind of sapiens you are. Now, if you happen to drift off during one of the chapters, no worries. I've added timestamps in the description, so tomorrow you can pick up exactly where the story left off, because this one is worth finishing. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Today, we're heading back to a world that disappeared, a land where mammoths walked across what's now open ocean, a place that connected Britain to Europe, until it didn't. This is the full story of how the lost world of Doggerland sank beneath the sea. Let's begin. Now, let's begin the story of a land that no longer exists, a place that vanished beneath the sea and might have stayed forgotten forever, if it weren't for a mistake made by a fishing boat in the year 1931. It began on a routine day, in a place where routine had lasted for centuries. Somewhere in the cold waters of the North Sea, off the east coast of England, a trawler from the Lowestoft fleet was dragging its nets across a shallow rise in the seafloor known to fishermen as Dogger Bank. The water here is thinner than elsewhere, only about 15 to 20 meters deep, and has long been known for its rich fishing grounds. That's how it got its name. A dogger was a type of Dutch fishing vessel common in the early modern period, and Dogger Bank was simply the place they went. But this particular day, the crew's nets didn't just pull up fish. Mixed in with the seaweed and silt was something heavier. Peat. Not mud, not clay, but peat. Dense, dark, plant-rich soil. The kind you would normally find in a bog, on land. And this wasn't just a tiny scrap. There were big chunks of it, enough to make the deck smell like a forest floor after rain. At first, it was probably just a curiosity. Fishermen are used to odd things from the deep, but someone noticed something else, tangled in the peat. It was small, curved, barbed, not metal, not modern, but unmistakably a tool, a barbed spear point made of antler bone shaped by human hands. And that raised a question no one aboard had any way to answer. What was a Stone Age hunting weapon doing at the bottom of the sea? The scientists who eventually examined the find were just as baffled, but they did what science always does. They began with what they could observe. The antler barb was clearly of prehistoric origin, similar to Mesolithic hunting tools found elsewhere on land. The peat itself was even more telling. Under a microscope, the structure of the peat showed it had formed from dense, decaying plant matter, meaning it had once been part of a terrestrial landscape, one with vegetation, sunlight, air, and buried inside that peat were ancient pollen grains, tiny time capsules, that told a story no one had expected. They pointed to a mixed woodland environment, trees like birch, hazel, and pine, the kind of forest that would have covered much of northern Europe after the last glacial period. But there was no forest in the middle of the North Sea. Not now, not for thousands of years. So what happened? Was this peat dragged in from the coast? A relic swept out to sea in some forgotten flood? Or, and this was the hypothesis that would slowly change the map, had there once been dry land here? A vast stretch of low-lying plains now submerged? And if so, how much land are we talking about? The answer would come slowly. This was not the age of satellite seafloor mapping or high-resolution sonar. In the early 20th century, scientists worked with shipping logs, fishing records, and occasional dredging samples. But even these primitive clues began to paint a strange picture. The North Sea floor between Britain and Denmark wasn't uniformly deep. It was full of ridges, valleys, and submerged river channels, including what appeared to be the ghost of a massive river system, one that had once drained much of the Thames, the Rhine, and the Elbe into a single delta. A river system that could only have formed on land. By the 1950s, a few marine geologists had begun calling the idea by a name, Doggerland, a lost landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Not a narrow isthmus, not a simple land bridge, but a landscape, wide, fertile, inhabited. A place where mammoths once walked, where red deer browsed in meadows, where reindeer migrated across frozen plains, and where humans, the same species watching this now, once lived, hunted, and raised children. Today, we take the existence of Doggerland as scientific consensus. We have bathymetric maps, sediment cores, and offshore drilling data that show the seafloor was once land. We've found more artifacts, flint tools, worked bones, even preserved tree roots, pulled up accidentally by dredging and oil rigs. And we now know that Doggerland didn't just vanish all at once. It was gradually submerged over thousands of years as the Ice Age ended and global sea levels rose. Then, sometime around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that likely erased the last high ground, the final islands, the last memories. But we'll get to that later. For now, what matters is the mystery at the heart of the discovery. The idea that the ocean, which we once thought of as permanent and static, had swallowed entire human landscapes. That the sea could be hiding not just shipwrecks, but civilizations. That the map we use today is not fixed, not eternal, but temporary. Just a snapshot in a long and shifting film strip of Earth's history. And perhaps the most humbling part of this discovery is how accidental it was. There was no expedition, no headline announcement, no dramatic press conference, just a handful of peat clumps scraped up by accident, by men looking for cod. It's a reminder of how much of our history is invisible, how much of our species' story lies buried, not in monuments or cities, but under silt, under ice, under the rising tides of climate and time. And it reminds us that science doesn't always arrive with certainty. Often, it begins with a question that no one asked on purpose, a shape in the wrong place, a tool in the wrong era, a barbed antler where no human should have been. In the end, this first clue, that barbed point from Doggerbank, did not answer the mystery of Doggerland, but it started the conversation. It opened the door, and it forced us to rethink what lies beneath our feet and beneath the waves. In the next chapter, we'll leave the trawlers behind and go back, way back, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone called it Doggerland, before there were coasts to flood or forests to remember. We'll step into a time when Britain was not an island, but simply one edge of a vast, frozen continent. And we'll ask a new question. Who were the first humans to walk across this now lost land, and how far back does their story really go? Let's go find out. The ocean is good at forgetting. Saltwater erodes, tides churn, currents level the past with a kind of silent efficiency that few human tools can match. But not everything vanishes. Not right away. Some traces sink instead, trapped in the folds of mud and silt, layered slowly, sealed quietly, waiting in the dark for someone to ask the right question. After the accidental discovery at Dogger Bank in the year 1931, the questions began. What was this peat doing so far from shore? Why did it contain tree pollen from species that should not have existed in open water? And how did a barbed antler spear end up tangled in it? At first, these were outliers, curiosities, one-off finds. But science has a habit of being patient. It asks again, and again, and again. It samples, it drills, it maps, it waits. And over the next 90 years, researchers would begin to realize that the sea itself was hiding a map. One that had to be read not with eyes, but with vibrations, chemistry, and an odd kind of geological empathy. The transformation began with the development of marine sediment coring in the mid-20th century. It's a simple idea. You lower a long, hollow tube to the seafloor. It punches into the layers of sediment and brings up a vertical sample, a core, of everything that has settled there millimeter by millimeter for thousands of years. Each core is a layered archive. The deeper you go, the older the material. And in those compressed strata, you find the smallest clues. Pollen grains from birch, pine, and hazel trees, microscopic freshwater diatoms, layers of peat that could not have formed underwater. Together, these tiny signatures confirmed what the trawlermen had only hinted at. The North Sea was once dry land, not briefly, not marginally, but for tens of thousands of years. And not just dry, fertile, wooded, alive. But knowing the land existed was only step one. Scientists wanted to reconstruct it, to map it, to give it shape. That's where seismic reflection technology entered the picture. Originally developed for the oil and gas industry, seismic surveys use controlled sound waves to probe beneath the seafloor. Ships drag arrays of underwater speakers and microphones behind them, sending pulses downward and listening for echoes. Different layers of sediment reflect sound differently, depending on their density, moisture, and composition. With enough passes and enough processing, those echoes can be turned into three-dimensional images, and suddenly, what was invisible became visible. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, teams of researchers, especially from the University of Birmingham and the University of Bradford, began using seismic data to reveal the ghost outlines of ancient valleys, rivers, hills, and lake beds under the North Sea. What they found was not a blank plain, but a rich, complex landscape, a web of waterways, floodplains, highlands, marshes. In some areas, clear signs of former coastlines, wave-cut terraces, and eroded cliffs. This wasn't just land, it was a place with topography, with variation, with a story. Bathymetric data, depth measurements of the seafloor, helped refine the picture. Collected through multi-beam sonar, it allowed researchers to build high-resolution digital elevation models of the submerged landscape. When overlaid with sediment cores and seismic profiles, the results were striking. You could trace the paths of rivers that once carried meltwater from the retreating Ice Age glaciers. You could identify dry basins that had held lakes. And in the central region, around the raised sandbanks of Dogger Bank, you could see where the last refuges of dry land might have held out even as the sea crept in. By the 2010s, these techniques had matured into a full scientific discipline, paleogeography of submerged landscapes. And Doggerland became its most iconic case. Archaeologists now had enough data to propose models of what the region looked like at different moments in time. They could map its coastlines at 16,000 years ago, then 13,000, then 10,000. They could estimate when different valleys flooded, when the rivers became estuaries, when the lakes turned into bays. It was like watching time-lapse footage of a continent dissolving, only played backward from fragments of mud. If you had looked at a map of Europe 500,000 years ago, you would not have recognized it. Not because the mountains were gone or the rivers had moved, those were largely where they are today, but because the coasts were wrong. The shorelines had stretched out like reaching fingers. Britain was not an island. There was no English Channel, no North Sea. The lands now submerged were not only dry, they were part of a vast, uninterrupted plain that joined the British Isles to the mainland in a seamless sweep of tundra, steppe, and forest. What we call Doggerland today was not a hidden world, it was simply part of the map. And for most of the last 1 million years, this was the default condition of Europe. To understand why, we have to understand the rhythm of ice. The Earth's climate over the last 2.5 million years has been shaped by glacial cycles, long alternating periods of cold and warmth, driven by slow, predictable changes in the planet's orbit, tilt, and wobble. These cycles, known collectively as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 cycles, influence how much sunlight different parts of the Earth receive and how it is distributed through the seasons. When orbital conditions align in certain ways, global temperatures fall, ice sheets advance, sea levels drop. When they shift again, the ice retreats and the oceans rise. This seesaw has repeated dozens of times, and each time, the map has redrawn itself. During the colder periods, known as glacials, enormous volumes of water became locked in continental ice sheets, especially across North America, Scandinavia, and parts of northern Asia. Sea levels during these glacial maxima could fall by more than 100 meters, exposing continental shelves all around the world. In Europe, this had dramatic effects. The shallow seabeds of the North Sea, the English Channel, and even the Irish Sea turned into walkable plains. Rivers carved new paths across these shelves, connecting ancient watersheds that today are separated by hundreds of kilometers of sea. The Thames joined the Rhine, the Seine merged with the Maas, and the ice-edged tundras of what is now Denmark stretched unbroken into Britain and beyond. It is in this context that Doggerland first existed, not as an anomaly, but as part of the exposed northern margin of Eurasia. From around 1 million to 120,000 years ago, this region repeatedly rose and fell with the pulse of the ice. And each time it was exposed, it was not empty, it was visited. One of the oldest known traces of human activity in Britain comes from this era. At Happisburgh in Norfolk, on what is now the eroding eastern coast of England, researchers uncovered a set of ancient footprints preserved in hardened estuary mud. They are more than 800,000 years old. The impressions were left by a small group of hominins, adults and children, walking along a river edge. Their identity is still debated, but they likely belong to an early species of the Homo genus, possibly Homo antecessor or a late Homo erectus. At the time, Britain was not a remote outpost. It was connected, accessible. One more fringe of the vast Eurasian steppe. Around 500,000 years ago, another hominin entered the story, Homo heidelbergensis. Taller and more robust than earlier species, these early humans were capable tool makers, able to hunt large game and survive in cold environments. Their stone tools, particularly hand axes, have been found across Britain, France, and Germany, including in the submerged zones that would later become Doggerland. Some sites, such as Boxgrove in southern England, preserve not only tools but butchered animal bones and traces of shelters, direct evidence of sustained human occupation during a time when the land stretched unbroken across the North Sea basin. But this period was not stable. The climate continued to oscillate. After each glacial maximum came a warmer interglacial. The ice would retreat, the seas would rise, and the low-lying corridors between Britain and Europe would vanish beneath the waves. These interglacials could last tens of thousands of years, and during them, Britain often became an island. Sometimes the connection remained through narrow isthmuses or marshy land bridges. Sometimes it was cut off entirely. These changes created alternating periods of connection and isolation, a pattern that shaped not only the migration of animals, but the evolution of humans themselves. The Neanderthals emerged during this volatile time. Descended from Homo heidelbergensis populations in Europe, the Neanderthals were well adapted to the cold, with stocky bodies, wide noses, and advanced hunting strategies. We often forget that the oldest footprints on British soil do not belong to modern humans. They do not belong to Neolithic farmers or Iron Age warriors or Roman soldiers. They were pressed into estuary mud by a child and a few adults who walked a river's edge more than 800,000 years ago. Their destination is unknown. Their identity is uncertain. But their prints were preserved by accident, hardened by time, and exposed by a falling tide on the Norfolk coast. And what they remind us is this: before there was Doggerland, before we even had the language to name such places, people walked this terrain, not once, but many times, across millennia, across climates, across shifting shorelines that blurred the line between land and sea. Between 700,000 and 40,000 years ago, northern Europe was a corridor of glacial winds, seasonal migration, and fleeting habitation. It was not always welcoming, but it was never completely empty. During colder phases of the Ice Age, much of the region was locked in permafrost or covered in vast steppe tundra ecosystems, populated by woolly mammoths, rhinos, reindeer, and bison. During warmer interglacials, the climate softened, and the land became covered in grasslands, wetlands, and forest patches. Each phase brought new possibilities and new risks for hominin survival. The earliest hominin species believed to have reached this region during this time was Homo heidelbergensis. These early humans were not wanderers in the modern sense. They were not farmers. They did not build permanent homes. But they had fire. They had language, or something close to it. And they had sharp stone tools, bifacial hand axes made from flint, shaped with skill, and used to butcher large animals with practiced ease. These tools appear throughout the archaeological record across what is now France, Germany, southern Britain, and, though mostly indirectly, in the submerged territories of the southern North Sea. Doggerland, during the exposed phases, would have been well within their range. We have no settlement sites from this period in Doggerland itself. That is not surprising. Most were temporary hunting camps, exposed on dry plains or nestled near river mouths, quickly abandoned and long since erased by the sea. But their cultural fingerprints remain, in the tools, in the butchery marks on fossilized bones, and in the shifting presence of species that only migrate when humans allow them to. In a place without cities, the past must be reconstructed from shards of flint and bone. That is the archaeology of Doggerland. It is a science built on fragments, and it demands a patience that sometimes spans decades. Around 400,000 years ago, another species enters the record with greater clarity: the Neanderthals. They did not come from somewhere else. They were already here, the descendants of earlier hominin groups that had survived the oscillations of glacial cycles. Their faces were broad, their bodies stocky, their limbs strong. These traits were not random. They were adaptations to the cold, to a life lived in exposed environments with minimal shelter. Neanderthals were not simple. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. They buried their dead. They created tools using specific designs and flint-knapping sequences. And they used the open plains of Doggerland to hunt big game in strategic, coordinated groups. Their presence is not abstract. At sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade on Jersey, which would have been part of the Doggerland coastline during low sea levels, we find butchered mammoth bones at the base of a ravine, hinting at a possible Neanderthal hunting strategy, stampeding large prey off cliffs to immobilize or kill them before descending to process the carcasses. It was not clumsy. It was planned. And it tells us that Neanderthals understood the landscape well enough to weaponize it. While direct Neanderthal sites in the submerged portions of Doggerland are sparse, the surrounding evidence suggests regular occupation. Flint tools consistent with Neanderthal craftsmanship have been recovered from seabed sediment dredged by fishing trawlers and oil exploration operations. These tools are scattered, displaced, and stripped of their original context, but they are real. And they come from areas now beneath 40 meters of water. They are some of the only voices left from lives erased by the sea. We often forget that the oldest footprints on British soil do not belong to modern humans. They do not belong to Neolithic farmers or Iron Age warriors or Roman soldiers. They were pressed into estuary mud by a child and a few adults who walked a river's edge more than 800,000 years ago. Their destination is unknown. Their identity is uncertain. But their prints were preserved by accident, hardened by time, and exposed by a falling tide on the Norfolk coast. And what they remind us is this: before there was Doggerland, before we even had the language to name such places, people walked this terrain, not once, but many times, across millennia, across climates, across shifting shorelines that blurred the line between land and sea. Between 700,000 and 40,000 years ago, northern Europe was a corridor of glacial winds, seasonal migration, and fleeting habitation. It was not always welcoming, but it was never completely empty. During colder phases of the Ice Age, much of the region was locked in permafrost or covered in vast steppe tundra ecosystems, populated by woolly mammoths, rhinos, reindeer, and bison. During warmer interglacials, the climate softened, and the land became covered in grasslands, wetlands, and forest patches. Each phase brought new possibilities and new risks for hominin survival. The earliest hominin species believed to have reached this region during this time was Homo heidelbergensis. These early humans were not wanderers in the modern sense. They were not farmers. They did not build permanent homes. But they had fire. They had language, or something close to it. And they had sharp stone tools, bifacial hand axes made from flint, shaped with skill, and used to butcher large animals with practiced ease. These tools appear throughout the archaeological record across what is now France, Germany, southern Britain, and, though mostly indirectly, in the submerged territories of the southern North Sea. Doggerland, during the exposed phases, would have been well within their range. We have no settlement sites from this period in Doggerland itself. That is not surprising. Most were temporary hunting camps, exposed on dry plains or nestled near river mouths, quickly abandoned and long since erased by the sea. But their cultural fingerprints remain, in the tools, in the butchery marks on fossilized bones, and in the shifting presence of species that only migrate when humans allow them to. In a place without cities, the past must be reconstructed from shards of flint and bone. That is the archaeology of Doggerland. It is a science built on fragments, and it demands a patience that sometimes spans decades. Around 400,000 years ago, another species enters the record with greater clarity: the Neanderthals. They did not come from somewhere else. They were already here, the descendants of earlier hominin groups that had survived the oscillations of glacial cycles. Their faces were broad, their bodies stocky, their limbs strong. These traits were not random. They were adaptations to the cold, to a life lived in exposed environments with minimal shelter. Neanderthals were not simple. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. They buried their dead. They created tools using specific designs and flint-knapping sequences. And they used the open plains of Doggerland to hunt big game in strategic, coordinated groups. Their presence is not abstract. At sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade on Jersey, which would have been part of the Doggerland coastline during low sea levels, we find butchered mammoth bones at the base of a ravine, hinting at a possible Neanderthal hunting strategy, stampeding large prey off cliffs to immobilize or kill them before descending to process the carcasses. It was not clumsy. It was planned. And it tells us that Neanderthals understood the landscape well enough to weaponize it. While direct Neanderthal sites in the submerged portions of Doggerland are sparse, the surrounding evidence suggests regular occupation. Flint tools consistent with Neanderthal craftsmanship have been recovered from seabed sediment dredged by fishing trawlers and oil exploration operations. These tools are scattered, displaced, and stripped of their original context, but they are real, and they come from areas now beneath 40 meters of water. They are some of the only voices left from lives erased by the sea. By 15,000 BCE, the cold was finally losing. The glaciers that had once carved scars across continents were in full retreat, and the colossal ice sheets that had buried half of Europe were melting into rivers that now fed a reborn world. Sea levels were still low, but the process had begun. What was once a barren, frozen tundra was greening. Grass returned first, then shrubs, then forests. And somewhere amid this long thaw, Doggerland came into its own. It was no longer just an exposed shelf. It was a place, a land between rivers, a thriving green heart of prehistoric Europe. For a brief stretch of deep time, Doggerland was not drowning. It was blooming. In this narrow window, roughly from 15,000 to 9,000 BCE, it became one of the richest ecological zones in the continent, a land of rivers and wetlands, of pine woods and hazel groves, of valleys echoing with hooves and wings. If it had a name back then, we do not know it. But if someone were to have described it, they might have simply said it was alive, because it was. To understand what made Doggerland so extraordinary during this period, we need to understand what was changing. The planet was exiting the last glacial maximum. Global temperatures began rising slowly after around 18,000 BCE, accelerating after 14,000 BCE. As the ice sheets in northern Europe pulled back, they released enormous volumes of meltwater, carving out new lakes, rerouting rivers, and raising sea levels, but only gradually. At first, the land was still vast. Britain was not an island. The North Sea was a plain, and Doggerland was the bridge between them. Geologists describe this re-emerging terrain as a vast, low-lying landmass spanning from what is now eastern England to the Netherlands, stretching as far north as modern Denmark and as far south as the Channel coast. But to the people who lived in it, it was a home without borders, a mosaic of ecological niches, a larder of wild game, fish, nuts, berries, and bone. This was a time before farming, before ceramics, before metal. These were the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the forgotten middle chapter of human life between the Ice Age and the Neolithic. And in Doggerland, they found a paradise carved not by gods, but by glaciers. The climate was more temperate than one might assume. Summers were warm enough to support dense woodlands. Winters were cold, but less severe than in the glacial periods before. As the ice sheets receded north, they opened up an enormous corridor for both animals and humans to follow. And what a parade it was. Mammoths still clung to the colder northern ranges in the earliest centuries of this era, though their time was running out. Reindeer migrated through the open steppe. Red deer, roe deer, and wild boar spread through the forest edges. Giant aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, thundered across open plains in small herds. Wolves, brown bears, lynx, and wildcats stalked their heels. Even lions and hyenas made appearances in the southern zones during warmer pulses. Europe was rewilding, and Doggerland was at the center of it. The people who moved through this land did not build cities or raise monuments, but they were far from simple. They were mobile, resilient, and astonishingly well adapted to the shifting environment around them. Their shelters were made of hides and timber. Their tools were crafted from flint, antler, and bone. Microliths, small, sharp stone blades, were hafted into composite tools like arrows, spears, and fishing gear. Fishing, in fact, seems to have become a major innovation of the Mesolithic in Doggerland. With so many rivers, estuaries, and coastal wetlands, aquatic resources were reliable and abundant. Fish traps, weirs, and harpoons made from antler appear in archaeological sites across Britain and the Low Countries from this period. And it is reasonable to believe similar strategies were used in Doggerland itself. One of the most revealing aspects of Mesolithic life comes from the scattered evidence of dietary diversity. Isotopic analysis of human bones from this era shows a wide variety of food sources. These were not narrowly focused mammoth hunters. They were foragers in the fullest sense, eating what the land gave them, adapting seasonally, moving fluidly through different ecosystems. Hazelnuts roasted in pits, shellfish gathered along tidal flats, migratory birds snared during nesting season, deer and boar hunted in forest glades. It was not luxury, but it was sustainable. And for thousands of years, it worked. Culturally, we can begin to speak of specific traditions and patterns, though the term culture in archaeology is a technical label. The Maglemosian culture, named after a peat bog site in Denmark, is one such grouping associated with this period in geography. It dates from around 9,000 to 6,000 BCE and is characterized by advanced bone and antler tools, dugout canoes, and evidence of semi-sedentary life along riverbanks and lake shores. Similar tools have been dredged from the southern North Sea and eastern British coasts, strongly implying that Doggerland was inhabited by people practicing these lifeways, even if we lack formal settlement sites. The reason we lack them, of course, is because they are now underwater. Most Mesolithic archaeology in the Doggerland region has come from either accidental finds, dragged up by fishing nets or offshore drilling, or from targeted seabed survey projects using side-scan sonar and seismic mapping. These technologies have revealed ancient river valleys, lake beds, and floodplains beneath the modern seafloor. When mapped, they show a land not of open desert, but of fertile promise. Some areas may have supported semi-permanent camps or even repeated seasonal occupations. In such places, families may have returned generation after generation, following the reindeer, tracking the fish runs, harvesting the ripening berries. This was not aimless wandering. This was memory made mobile. It is tempting to romanticize these people as noble savages, living in harmony with nature. But they were not mythical beings. They were humans. They had injuries, diseases, losses. They shaped their environments, burned forests, cleared paths, overhunted species, just like we do. But their scale was smaller, their footprint lighter, their lives, by necessity, more attentive to the rhythms of the land. In Doggerland, there was still room for the wild to breathe. Perhaps the most haunting part of this golden age is how little we actually know about its human stories. We have their tools, their discarded bones, their altered landscapes, but we do not have their language. We do not know what they believed. We can guess, based on analogies with modern hunter-gatherer groups, that they held animistic worldviews, saw spirits in rivers and trees, respected the animals they hunted. But it is speculation. Their myths are gone. Their names are gone. What remains is the land, or rather, the memory of it. By 9000 BCE, the tide was turning, both metaphorically and literally. The glaciers were nearly gone. The oceans were rising. Doggerland's golden window was beginning to close. The rivers that once wound lazily through floodplains began to swell. Wetlands expanded. Lowlands became marshes. And the sea crept closer. For now, life went on. But the age of open migration across Europe's Green Bridge was coming to an end. Soon, Doggerland would fragment. Not all at once, and not without warning. But piece by piece, the land would fall to the sea. In the next segment, we will explore that slow unraveling. The waters will rise, the forest paths will vanish, and the people who once walked the heart of Doggerland will be pushed to its edges, forced to watch the world they knew dissolve, not in myth, but in water. They left behind no stone cities, no colossal statues, no decipherable writing. If you were to walk their land today, you would be underwater, somewhere between the eastern coast of Britain and the shallows of the Dutch North Sea shelf. But from around 9,000 to 6,000 years before the present era, this land was real. It was walkable, breathable, and home. And the people who lived there were not primitive shadows. They were complex, mobile, and adaptive, humans in every sense of the word, carving out entire lifeways in a world on the edge of disappearance. This was the final chapter of Doggerland as a human landscape, and it may be one of the most quietly significant disappearances in European prehistory. By 9000 BCE, the massive ice sheets that had once crushed northern Europe were long in retreat. The glaciers that had buried much of Scandinavia were melting away, and the seas, held back for thousands of years by sheer frozen volume, were beginning to rise. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, the ocean licked at the fringes of the low-lying land between Britain and the continent. But at this point, Doggerland was still very real. Its higher elevations, like what is now Doggerbank, may have stood as grassy hills, and its lower floodplains as lush wetlands rich with fish, fowl, and grazing game. This was a place of ecological richness and cultural quietude. The people who lived here are hard to name in any absolute way. We do not know what they called themselves, but in the archaeological record, they are often associated with the broader Maglemosian culture, named after a site in Denmark and dated to roughly 9,000 to 6,000 BCE. They were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, inheritors of both Ice Age adaptations and new Holocene opportunities. They were part of a broader wave of rewilding Europe, not in the ecological sense we use the word today, but in the human one. These were not scattered, lonely bands. The evidence suggests coordinated lifeways, patterns of seasonal migration, tool exchange, and deep familiarity with their local ecosystems. We cannot excavate Doggerland in the traditional sense. It is mostly seabed now, but we do find their signatures at the edges, on the coasts of modern Britain, Denmark, the Netherlands, and around the North Sea basin. The flint tools are delicate, but not crude. Barbed antler harpoons, microlithic arrowheads, and polished axes speak to a technical understanding of their craft and materials. Bone fishing weirs suggest strategic exploitation of tidal zones. In some sites, concentrations of hazelnut shells imply seasonal camps, possibly autumnal gathering spots. These were people who knew where the deer would pass, when the eels would rise, and how to store fat-rich resources for leaner months. And yet they did not build in stone. They did not construct pyramids or leave behind preserved cities. Their architecture, if any, was likely wooden, skin-covered, or entirely ephemeral. What this means archaeologically is absence. But absence is not evidence of simplicity. Complexity can exist in the oral, the seasonal, the spatial, not only the monumental. It is easy to mistake silence for emptiness, but these people knew their land, and perhaps more importantly, they knew how to move through it. Theirs was a world without fences, where territory was defined not by ownership, but by knowledge of landscape and cycles. Some of the clearest insights into these types of Mesolithic lifeways come from the Oransay Middens in Scotland and other analog coastal sites. While not Doggerland itself, these sites show us how coastal Mesolithic peoples lived, through shell heaps, tool scatters, and the remains of consumed animals. They show a pattern of seasonal movement, marine exploitation, and social structure that is mobile but not chaotic. They were likely organized in small kin-based groups, able to meet, merge, and split in fluid patterns depending on season and resources. Doggerland, with its rivers, estuaries, and marshes, would have supported a similar if not richer tapestry of these seasonal rounds. And then there is the sea. It would have started to rise slowly, a few millimeters per year. Nothing dramatic, no singular wave, But over centuries, the world changed. Coastal camps became wetlands. Wetlands became marshy lagoons. The rivers changed course. The hunting grounds shifted. Each generation might have noticed only minor changes: a favorite fishing spot no longer viable, a new estuary forming inland. But taken over 10 or 20 generations, the transformation was massive. Land disappeared. Migration corridors were drowned. Settlements on the lower ground were abandoned. This was not a sudden apocalypse. It was a creeping erosion of space, a vanishing of the map, year by year, tide by tide. Did they understand what was happening? Did they fear it, or simply adapt to it? These are the questions we can ask, but not fully answer. Oral traditions do not fossilize. And in cultures without written language, the memory of place often disappears with the people who once lived there. But it is reasonable to imagine that such changes were noticed, perhaps even ritualized. Many Mesolithic cultures across Europe built wooden platforms near water, created votive deposits of animal bones and tools, or engaged in what appear to be seasonal rituals. It is not hard to imagine a people watching the sea slowly swallow their familiar world and responding with stories, warnings, or ceremonies that were never carved in stone. The end of Doggerland as habitable land was not uniform. The higher parts, like Dogger Island, likely remained above water for longer, possibly until 6000 BCE or even later. There may have been people living on that final fragment, still practicing Mesolithic lifeways, even as the rest of their world vanished beneath the tides. Some archaeologists have even suggested that the Storegga tsunami, a massive sea surge caused by an underwater landslide around 6200 BCE, may have been the final blow, a cataclysm that erased the last of the land bridge connecting Britain to the continent. But long before that singular wave, the sea had already been winning. It is possible, though speculative, that some Doggerland peoples moved inland as the sea encroached, assimilating into neighboring groups or establishing new seasonal territories. Others may have died with the land they knew. This is the nature of prehistoric archaeology. We see fragments, never full lives. But even from the fragments, we can see a pattern: mobile, adaptive, deeply ecological humans responding to a world in flux. And we can see, too, that the loss of Doggerland was not a mythic event, but a slow, tangible, observable disappearance, recorded not in legends, but in the silence of the seabed. Today, the youngest known artifact found in Doggerland sediment is dated to roughly 6050 BCE, a flint tool, possibly dropped by a person who was watching the shorelines change, possibly not. But what we can say is that Doggerland was inhabited right up until the waters made it impossible, and that this final phase, this final 3,000 years of human presence on a doomed land, tells us something about the resilience and fragility of human life in the face of environmental change. There were no epic battles, no sudden collapses, just people moving slowly, adjusting quietly, and eventually disappearing without a trace. When we talk about the end of Doggerland, we are not talking about a single event. We are talking about a process, a drawn-out exhale of land into sea, a vanishing so gradual that it might not have even felt like a catastrophe at the time. But in retrospect, it was the disappearance of a continent-sized ecosystem, and a world of human memory that now lies scattered beneath the North Sea, waiting for dredgers, sonar, or a lucky trawl to pull up a trace. A tool, a bone, a hint of a life once lived on land that no longer exists. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: the people who walked that land, who carved those spears, who fished those rivers, were not that different from us. They adapted to change until they couldn't. They made meaning from landscape until the landscape itself dissolved. They lived in a world that felt solid, until it didn't. And if there is a lesson in Doggerland, it is not just about prehistory. It is about the quiet ways in which land disappears and how entire worlds can be lost without anyone raising their voice. Stay curious. Stay calm. The sea is still rising. If you had been standing on the green spine of Doggerland in the early Holocene, sometime around 9,000 years before the present, you would not have seen the end of the world. Not immediately. The rivers still flowed, the trees still rustled, and the reindeer still passed through their seasonal paths. The air would have smelled like birch sap and wet earth. but the edge was creeping. Slowly, steadily, almost invisibly, the sea was coming. And it wasn't just the North Sea that was changing. The transformation of Doggerland into a fragmented archipelago was part of a much bigger story, a planetary system waking from a deep freeze, a reshuffling of water, heat, and coastlines across the globe. The drowning of Northern Europe was just one note in a global chord, one that began with a hidden monster melting quietly in the west. Glaciers are not polite guests. They do not come and go without leaving a mess. During the height of the last glacial maximum, perhaps around 20,000 years ago, the northern hemisphere wore an icy crown. Enormous glaciers like the Laurentide ice sheet covered what is now much of Canada and parts of the northern United States. Elsewhere, thick domes of ice smothered Scandinavia, Britain, and parts of northern Europe. These sheets locked away vast quantities of water, enough to drop global sea levels by around 120 to 125 meters. But what comes down must eventually go back up. As the climate warmed in the millennia after the glacial peak, the melt began. Slowly at first, then rapidly, the ice began to break apart, feeding rivers, lakes, and eventually the oceans. One of the most consequential of these meltwater systems was Lake Agassiz. Named after the Swiss-American glaciologist Louis Agassiz, this prehistoric lake was not just large, it was immense. Formed as meltwater pooled in front of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet, Lake Agassiz at its peak may have covered over 440,000 square kilometers, more surface area than any modern lake on Earth, larger even than the Black Sea. It stretched across present-day Manitoba, Ontario, and parts of Minnesota and North Dakota. Its southern shores met grasslands, its northern margins pressed against walls of retreating ice, but its fate was not to last. As the ice dams that held Agassiz's waters in place weakened, geological pressure built. At least once, and possibly multiple times, Lake Agassiz burst. These were not leaks. They were sudden, violent outpourings. Walls of fresh water surged through newly opened channels, pouring into the Arctic Ocean, the North Atlantic, and possibly the Gulf of Mexico. The dates are debated, but one of the most widely discussed outbursts is thought to have occurred around 8,200 years ago. This timing places it squarely within the period when Doggerland was undergoing dramatic environmental change. The idea that something melting in North America could help flood a continent across the Atlantic may sound far-fetched, but Earth's climate and ocean systems are intricately connected. Water does not respect borders, and neither do consequences. These freshwater surges had two major effects. First, they added volume to the world's oceans. A sudden input of thousands of cubic kilometers of water raised sea levels measurably and quickly. Some estimates suggest global sea levels rose by several meters over relatively short time spans during these episodes. Second, and perhaps more dramatically, the influx of cold fresh water disrupted oceanic circulation patterns, specifically the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒. This system, driven by the sinking of cold, salty water in the North Atlantic, helps regulate climate across the planet. When the surface waters become diluted with fresh water, their density drops, slowing or even halting the circulation. This in turn can lead to regional cooling, shifting storm tracks, and changing precipitation patterns. Climate archives suggest that one such disruption may have caused the so-called 8,200-year event, a sudden global cooling that lasted for several centuries, affecting ecosystems and human populations from Europe to the tropics. For the inhabitants of Doggerland, the exact mechanism of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 would not have mattered. What mattered was the encroaching sea. By around 9,000 BCE, much of Doggerland was still above water, but it had already become a land of lakes, marshes, and rising tides. As the climate warmed, the low-lying areas between what is now Britain and the continent began to fill with water. Rivers like the Thames, the Rhine, and the Elbe continued to carve their paths across the landscape, but their lower reaches were becoming tidal. What had once been broad, grassy plains teeming with life were transforming into brackish estuaries and shallow inlets. Coastal erosion accelerated as soils softened and tree roots gave way to saltwater intrusion. The map changed slowly, but not invisibly. Where there had been forest, now there was fen. Where there had been dry paths, now there were reeds and silt. The highlands of what would become Dogger Bank stood firm for a time, but they were islands in the making. Around the world, similar processes were unfolding. In Southeast Asia, The Sunda Shelf had connected what are now the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java to the Asian mainland. In the Americas, the Bering Land Bridge once linked Siberia and Alaska, allowing humans and animals to cross between continents. In the Persian Gulf, river valleys were being drowned. What had been terrestrial corridors of migration and trade were becoming submerged memories. The early Holocene was an age of disappearance, not sudden, but steady. And the memory of these changes, where preserved, may have lingered long after the last dry footfall. Some scholars have speculated that global flood myths, from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas, may be rooted in cultural memories of these rising waters. While the stories differ in content and cosmology, the pattern is consistent. A world transformed by water, a landscape lost, a people changed. But unlike the mythical Atlantis, Doggerland is not legend. It is not conjecture. We have its pollen, its peat, its spear points, its sediment cores. We know it existed, and we know how it vanished. Or at least we know parts of the story. The precise timing of submergence varied across the landscape. Some areas may have gone under as early as 10,000 years ago. Others likely remained habitable until around 6,000 BCE. What is clear is that by the late Mesolithic, most of Doggerland had become a scattered set of islands and wetlands, with fewer and fewer places to live, to hunt, to bury the dead. Some communities likely migrated inland, following game and freshwater sources. Others may have clung to the higher ground until the last. There are no written records, no ruins of temples, no stone inscriptions marking the end. But there are clues, buried in silt, scattered along the seabed, hinting at lives adapted to change, and eventually swallowed by it. The transformation of Doggerland into seabed is often framed as a loss, and in many ways it was. But it also reminds us of the dynamism of Earth's surface. Coastlines are not fixed lines. They breathe, retreat, and expand. Sea levels rise and fall, landscapes appear and vanish. What was once a hunting ground becomes a shipping lane. What was once forest becomes mudflats. And beneath those mudflats, we find the layered remnants of a world that was never meant to last forever. It's humbling, in a quiet way, to remember that permanence is mostly illusion. The people of Doggerland did not disappear because they failed. They adapted for as long as adaptation was possible, and then the water came too fast. Even now, in the 21st century, we are watching the edges of our own world shift again. Glaciers are melting, seas are rising, islands are shrinking, the mechanisms are more complex, the societies more industrial. But the basic reality is not so different from 9,000 years ago. A land once lived in becomes a land remembered. A shoreline walks a little farther inland, and the water does not ask permission. Next, we'll examine one final, devastating blow. The tsunami that may have ended Doggerland's last stand. But before that, we pause here. At the moment, the sea turned from background to foreground. At the moment, the land beneath became history. Because from this point on, the story of Doggerland becomes a story of what was lost. By the start of the 7th millennium before the Common Era, a slow inevitability had settled over the vast lowlands that once formed the connective tissue of northern Europe. For tens of thousands of years, people and animals had crossed this land bridge, this broad and marshy stretch of territory now called Doggerland, on foot, season after season, year after year. The land between what we now call Britain and continental Europe had been thick with rivers, ponds, forests, and reed-choked estuaries. It was never a single road, but a maze of seasonal paths, delta crossings, dry ridges, and open meadows. And now, inch by inch, it was dying. Or rather, it was drowning. The final flooding of the land bridge that once linked Britain to the rest of Europe was not a single moment but a rolling sequence of losses, some rapid, some agonizingly slow. Across thousands of square kilometers of what had once been dry terrain, the sea crept in with a kind of amoral patience. Geologists and marine archaeologists working today have tried to piece together what that looked like, not through eyewitness accounts, but by drilling into the seafloor and decoding the language of sediment. Beneath layers of modern marine mud lie older beds of compacted peat, pollen-rich silt, and buried soil horizons that were once walked on. In these layers, scientists have found the fossilized root systems of trees, animal bones broken by butchering, charcoal from ancient hearths, and, in rare cases, the tools of the people who lived and moved through this place. Between 7,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era, the final disconnection of Britain from the continent appears to have taken place. One of the key lines of evidence comes from the English Channel and the southern North Sea, where underwater ridges show signs of ancient river valleys, now drowned, having been breached and replaced by saline currents. At this stage, Doggerland was no longer a wide expanse. It had already been reduced to a patchwork of wetlands and seasonal islets. What remained of the land bridge was likely a narrow, elevated corridor of earth connecting southeastern Britain to what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. But as the sea level continued to rise, driven by the melting of continental glaciers far beyond Europe, this final link was severed. From a scientific standpoint, this transition is fascinating because it involved complex, overlapping systems: the retreat of glacial ice in North America, the destabilization of meltwater lakes like Agassiz and Ojibwe, the slow rebound of the Earth's crust after being depressed by ice sheets, and the thermal expansion of warming oceans. These are not simple linear processes. They are global, dynamic, and at times unpredictable. Some models suggest that sudden jumps in sea level, so-called meltwater pulses, may have overwhelmed natural drainage systems and inundated low-lying areas rapidly, turning passable terrain into mudflats, then into brackish estuaries, and finally, into open sea. What did this mean for the humans who were living there? That question has no definitive answer, but the archaeological record gives us fragments. Across sites in eastern England, northern France, and the Low Countries, we find material evidence of Mesolithic communities that seem to shift location and adapt their toolkits as the environment around them changed. Flint microliths, barbed antler points, bone harpoons, and fish traps made of woven wood appear in increasing density along what would have been the ancient coastlines. There is a visible move toward aquatic resources. Shell middens grow larger, and there is more evidence of specialized fishing gear. In short, people were adapting, but whether they understood what was happening at a larger scale is uncertain. This is one of those places where science must admit the limits of its vision. We can track the pace of marine transgression, we can date the layers of peat and pollen, but we cannot know what it felt like to live through the last years of Doggerland as a connected land. Some archaeologists have speculated that communities may have begun to treat the shifting coast as sacred or dangerous. Others suggest that repeated displacement may have fractured groups or pushed them toward more permanent settlement on higher ground. A few oral traditions in Western Europe speak vaguely of lands lost to the sea, but none can be conclusively tied to Doggerland. For now, the people of this drowned land have no written record, no monuments, no lasting cities. Their presence is felt only through the erosion of their absence. That absence, however, matters. The final separation of Britain from continental Europe was not just a geological event, but a moment of profound cultural reorganization. When the last walkable path was gone, likely sometime close to 6,200 years before the Common Era, everything changed. Britain became an island, and islands make different kinds of people. Isolation alters genetics, language, trade, and worldview. Over time, the groups who remained in what we now call Britain would evolve distinctive material cultures, from the late Mesolithic through the Neolithic transition and into the Bronze Age. Their agriculture, their monument building, their spiritual landscapes, all of it began to diverge from their continental cousins. That divergence may have started with a rising tide. From a broader ecological and evolutionary standpoint, this kind of isolation is not rare. We see it repeatedly in the history of Earth, from the formation of the Galapagos to the fragmentation of Sundaland in Southeast Asia. When sea levels rise, when land bridges disappear, when coastlines fracture, the organisms that remain behind begin to walk different paths. And humans are no exception. In a sense, Doggerland's disappearance gave birth not just to an island, but to an island identity. Whether its last inhabitants watched the waters rise with dread or simply shifted to higher ground, their story is now embedded in the bedrock of the North Sea. It is worth noting that Britain's final separation from the continent was not synchronous across every region. Some low-lying areas may have remained passable during certain times of year depending on tides, weather, and sedimentation. What this means is that even as the land bridge narrowed and became unreliable, people may have continued to use it for some time, crossing during dry spells, navigating by memory, or following the trails of animals. The last crossings may not have been migrations in the dramatic sense, but quiet, hesitant walks across uncertain terrain, one step at a time, toward a place they could still see across the waves. Then, one day, the path was gone. In modern terms, this sounds like a quiet moment, but the implications were profound. Trade routes were disrupted. Seasonal hunting grounds vanished. Fishing practices had to adapt to deeper, saltier waters. Communities who had once been part of a shared ecological zone were now sundered by a widening channel. And over generations, what had once been a familiar coastline became a forgotten one. Today, the only way we reconstruct this story is through the combined tools of marine geology, paleoecology, and archaeological modeling. Scientists use multi-beam sonar to map submerged river channels. They extract long cores of sediment from the seabed and analyze trapped pollen grains to reconstruct ancient vegetation. They simulate sea level curves based on global ice melt scenarios and local land uplift. And in rare cases, they recover artifacts, microliths, harpoons, hearth charcoal, that confirm the human presence in places now 40 meters underwater. These fragments, scattered across the North Sea basin, are all that remain of a world that connected rather than divided. And while they cannot give us a complete picture, they tell us something simple and true. People lived here, and then they didn't. Some researchers have referred to Doggerland as Europe's Atlantis, but the comparison is not quite right. Atlantis was a metaphor, a morality tale. Doggerland was real. It was not a utopia, but a habitat. It had no marble palaces, but it fed reindeer and humans alike. It did not vanish overnight in some cosmic punishment, but succumbed over centuries to the physics of a warming world. It was the kind of place that did not need to be mythical to matter. What remains today is not just its drowned topography, but its legacy. The island that Britain became, the coastal cultures that emerged on both sides of the channel, the shifting identities and languages and tools, all of these carry traces of that slow disappearance. And the questions it raises are not merely academic. They touch on how humans respond to environmental change, how we adapt to new boundaries, how we grieve lost places, even when they leave no monuments behind. If there were any witnesses to the last day one could walk from Kent to Calais, we will never know their names. But we do know they were real, and that their footprints, like so many others in prehistory, now lie beneath the waves. It is easy to imagine land loss as something slow, a quiet tide creeping up over the generations. A meadow becomes a marsh, the marsh turns brackish, and then one day a fisherman's grandson realizes the bay was once where his people held midsummer dances. But sometimes it is not slow. Sometimes the earth shifts with a suddenness that leaves no time to mourn, let alone prepare. And one such moment, one of the largest natural disasters to strike prehistoric Europe, began deep underwater, far to the north of the land that would eventually be called Doggerland. Around 6,200 years before the present day, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway released an unimaginable wall of debris into the ocean. The event, now known as the Storegga Slide, set off a chain reaction that sent a towering wall of water racing across the North Sea. And although Doggerland by that point was already a shadow of its former size, it may have been the final blow, the last violent chapter in the story of a drowned world. To understand the Storegga Slide, we need to begin not with humans, but with mud. Thick, heavy, layered mud, deposited slowly by retreating glaciers during the long, cold epochs of the Pleistocene. Off the coast of what is now Norway, a vast accumulation of marine sediments had built up over many millennia. These sediments, known to geologists as glacio-marine deposits, are often stable, but only up to a point. When the balance tips, when seismic tremors, gas hydrate release, or simply gravity itself intervenes, all that material can suddenly collapse. And in the case of Storegga, it did so on a continental scale. The slide released more than 3,000 cubic kilometers of material, an amount comparable to the volume of Mount Fuji collapsing into the sea. We are not speaking here of a landslide as we might picture it on land, with tumbling boulders and scattered trees. This was an entire underwater slope giving way in a single catastrophic pulse, sending sediment cascading outward and downward in a slurry of mass movement across the sea floor. The energy released was enough to displace entire water columns, generating a tsunami estimated to have reached heights of up to 20 meters as it approached nearby coastlines. Radiocarbon dating from tsunami deposits in places like eastern Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and northern mainland Europe has helped triangulate the date of the event to just over 6,200 years ago. For comparison, this was long before the Egyptian pyramids, before the invention of writing in Mesopotamia, and well before any record-keeping culture in Europe. The people living in these landscapes had no words for what was coming. What we do have are the traces it left behind. In low-lying parts of eastern Scotland, such as the Montrose Basin, researchers have found thin layers of fine sand sitting atop peaty soil. These layers are out of place. The sand is marine in origin, deposited far inland from where the shoreline once lay. Microscopic analysis confirms the sudden influx of marine diatoms and disrupted pollen profiles. This is how you spot a prehistoric tsunami, not with eyewitness accounts or carved monuments, but with microscopic plankton, displaced soil horizons, and chaotic sediment layering. In one core sample from the Shetland Islands, a storm-free marine deposit sandwiched between two peat layers told a tale more violent than any written myth. The tsunami had surged inland, deposited its load, and then retreated, leaving silence behind. As for Doggerland, its state at the time of the tsunami is still debated. By 6,200 BCE, the vast majority of the land that once connected Britain to the continent had already been submerged by the steady rise of post-glacial seas. What remained was likely a chain of low-lying islands, with Dogger Island being the largest and most prominent. This was the last exposed remnant of a world that had already been fracturing for thousands of years. Some have argued that even this final outcrop may have been abandoned by the time the Storegga slide struck. Others suggest that scattered populations may have remained, making use of the dwindling land for seasonal fishing or waterfowl hunting. If so, they would have faced a wall of water that gave little warning and no mercy. In the wider archaeological record, there is no clear evidence of widespread cultural collapse tied directly to the tsunami. No burned villages, no broken settlements, no sudden shift in tool types. But that absence itself is revealing. These were people without monumental architecture, without stone houses or clay tablets. Their culture was encoded in bone harpoons, in campfire soot, in paths through the reeds. A flood need not destroy stone walls to erase a memory. It simply needs to erase the land. It is difficult for us to picture what it must have been like to be there, on a low, flat island, waking up to an unfamiliar tremble in the sea, perhaps noticing birds fleeing inland, or watching the horizon bulge in ways no human had ever seen. The wave may have struck within an hour or two of the slide, or less. The waters would have surged, overrun, dragged forests into the sea, and pulled everything loose along with it. There would have been no time to pack, no time to flee far, and no time to understand what was happening. The moment would have been sensory, chaotic, and brief. And yet, as dramatic as the Storegga tsunami was, it did not cause the disappearance of Doggerland, at least not by itself. The long retreat had already been underway for thousands of years. Sea levels had been rising due to the melting of the great ice sheets in North America and Eurasia. The once unified lowland plain had been turned into an archipelago of mudflats, marshes, and shrinking highlands. In many ways, the tsunami was less a cause than a punctuation mark, a violent underscore at the end of a sentence already written by time and water. Still, the Storegga event serves as a vivid reminder that not all environmental change is slow. For much of the Doggerland story, we have spoken in centuries and millennia of gradual shifts and creeping coastlines. But this was different. It was an instant, a moment when the sea, for once, moved faster than memory. And even today, the legacy of the Storegga slide lives on not only in sediment cores but in scientific models used to assess future risks. Geologists now study this ancient collapse to understand the stability of modern continental slopes. With climate change melting permafrost and destabilizing seafloor sediments around the Arctic, some worry about new submarine landslides in the future. Could another Storegga happen again? Possibly. Though rare, such events are not unique in Earth's history, and if one were to occur near modern population centers, the results could be catastrophic on a vastly different scale. For the Mesolithic peoples of Northern Europe, the tsunami may have reshaped the world in a more subtle way. It may have reinforced patterns of migration, Communities displaced from coastal areas might have moved inland or westward. Traditions tied to marshlands may have been lost or transformed. And in oral traditions, if they existed, perhaps something of the wave was passed down, not as geology, but as myth. A storm that ate the world, a flood that came from the north. In the end, we do not know how many lives were lost to the Storegga tsunami. We may never find skeletal remains or campsites disrupted mid-meal. The archaeological record is poor in flooded zones, and preservation is spotty at best. But what we do have is a geological fingerprint, clear and cold, telling us that something vast and violent happened, just as the last fragments of Doggerland were giving way to the sea. And perhaps that is all we need. Not a death toll or a tragedy in numbers, but a sense of scale. A reminder that even in a world without cities or stone, people could be swept aside by forces they had no means to understand. The Storegga slide is not just a geological event, it is a chapter in the human story, a turning point where nature, for a moment, shouted loud enough to erase a continent's whisper. Next, we will explore what came after the silence, what the sea left behind, and how memory turned to myth. There is a moment after every disaster when the silence feels thicker than the impact. The sea has receded, the winds have calmed, and there is no more motion, only aftermath. That moment is nearly impossible to reconstruct from 6,000 years away. But if anything lingered on the remnants of Doggerland after the Storegga tsunami, it would have existed in precisely that kind of silence, an era not of flooding, but of fading. This was not a cinematic vanishing, not a sudden descent into the waves. It was an extended ending, a slow unraveling of a landscape and the cultures tied to it. The tsunami was perhaps the most violent act in Doggerland's long drowning, but it was not necessarily the final one. The question is whether anything or anyone managed to persist in the aftermath. And to answer that, we need to explore not just what was destroyed, but what may have survived. The wave that struck around 6,200 BCE was monumental in scope, and the sediment layers left behind in places like eastern Scotland and the Shetland Islands testify to its power. But when it comes to Dogger Island, the last substantial protrusion of the once vast Doggerland, the evidence becomes slippery. At the time of the tsunami, this island was still above sea level, a low-lying stretch of land perhaps no larger than a few hundred square kilometers. Whether it was still inhabited is not something we can state with certainty. The archaeological record here is defined by its absence, not because people did not live there, but because whatever they built, whatever they left behind, is now submerged beneath silt and sand and layers of marine deposition that obscure the faintest human trace. There are, however, a few stubborn clues. Underwater surveys in the southern North Sea have turned up the occasional artifact, worked flints, antler tools, and even what may be remnants of hearths or post holes. But the context is always fragmentary. One can recover a barbed point from the seabed, but not the hand that held it. We are left assembling a puzzle with most of its pieces lost to water, and the pieces we do have raise difficult questions. Was this artifact deposited before the tsunami, or after? Could Dogger Island have remained habitable for a few more generations, or even a few centuries, after the wave? Or was the tsunami simply the final curtain? In scientific circles, this is not a settled matter. Some researchers propose that Dogger Island may have persisted above sea level as late as 6,000 BCE, that is, for as much as 2 centuries after the Storegga event. The evidence comes from sediment cores and paleo-environmental reconstructions that suggest there were still terrestrial conditions in that part of the seabed. But others argue that even if land remained, it may have been rendered uninhabitable, either by the scouring force of the tsunami, by saltwater incursion, or by the psychological weight of catastrophe. It is one thing to live beside the sea. It is another to watch it take everything in a single afternoon. What we do not have are any direct human remains from Dogger Island's final days. No burials, no skeletons, no formalized campsites. This might seem like proof of absence, but it is more accurately absence of proof. Preservation conditions underwater are capricious at best. Organic materials decay, currents scatter. The North Sea is one of the world's busiest maritime zones, and centuries of fishing trawlers have churned its bottom like a plow across ancient memory. What survived the wave may have been physically erased long before modern archaeologists even knew where to look. Still, not all survival is material. One way to track what might have happened in Doggerland's wake is to follow the movement of people and culture. Around this time, between 6200 and 6000 BCE, we begin to see shifts in Mesolithic patterns in Britain and northern continental Europe. In southern Scandinavia, new settlement forms appear. In the British Isles, there is evidence of population clustering along new inland rivers and lakes, suggesting retreat from formerly coastal zones. It is tempting to imagine that some of these groups included refugees from Doggerland, people who had lived on the shrinking archipelago and, after the wave, chose never to return. This is speculative, of course. We cannot identify a flint scraper as belonging to someone who once walked the banks of Dogger Island. But in archaeology, cultural continuity can sometimes whisper what the landscape no longer shows. Shared tool styles, fishing techniques, seasonal rhythms. These echoes may be all that is left of the last Doggerlanders. They survived, perhaps, not as a people in place, but as a people in motion, folded into neighboring communities, bringing with them knowledge of tides, of fish, of winds, and of loss. And here, we arrive at the philosophical question that shadows all studies of disappearance. What does it mean for a place to vanish? Does it require physical submersion, cultural extinction, loss of memory? Doggerland by this point was no longer a homeland in the way we often imagine one. It had become fragmented, uncertain, temporary. But it may still have lived on in stories, in warnings, in rituals. A place where the sea came up fast, a place that taught something about impermanence. There are hints, though they are frustratingly ambiguous. In later European folklore, especially from island and coastal cultures, we see recurring motifs of sunken lands, drowned cities, and disappearing shores. Names like Lioness, Ease, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒. Are these remnants of oral memories from events like Doggerland's final flood? Some anthropologists suggest that catastrophic natural events can linger in oral traditions for millennia, transformed into myth but preserving a kernel of truth. If that is the case, perhaps Doggerland did not vanish entirely. Perhaps it became a cautionary tale passed between generations, changing shape with every retelling, until it was no longer a place on a map, but a feeling in the bones. From a geological perspective, Dogger Island did not vanish in a single event. After the tsunami, sea levels continued to rise, slowly but relentlessly. By around 6000 BCE, most reconstructions agree that even the highest points were underwater. The final chapter of Doggerland is therefore one of gradual silencing. A few last fishing camps, a few last trails through reeds, then nothing, only water, only the North Sea. In this way, what survived the wave is perhaps more important than what did not. The human capacity to adapt, to move, to preserve fragments of knowledge even in the face of ecological loss. It is a quiet kind of resilience, not the kind sung in epic poems or carved in stone, but the kind passed in murmurs and muscle memory. Where to fish, when to move, how to survive when the land itself becomes unreliable. And so, as we close this chapter, we are left with a paradox. Doggerland disappeared, and yet it did not. Its people may have vanished, but they also continued, in new lands, under new skies, carrying the unspoken history of a world the sea reclaimed. The tsunami was not the end of the story, only the end of a location. The human story, as always, flowed forward. Next, we turn to what Doggerland left behind beneath the waves, and what modern science is only now beginning to uncover. The strange thing about Doggerland is not that it vanished. Landscapes change, seas rise, continents fracture. That part is ordinary. What is strange is that we forgot. For something that once connected Britain to the mainland, for a land that teemed with animals and scattered camps of humans for hundreds of thousands of years, Doggerland left behind no name, no maps, no myths we can confidently trace. From around 6000 BCE until the early years of modern science, it simply slipped out of human memory. Not misremembered, not misrepresented, just gone. And perhaps that is the most haunting thing about this sunken world. It did not end in war or fire or even myth. It ended in silence. The reasons are many. First, there were no cities to leave behind stones, no carvings to shout across the centuries. The people of Doggerland were Mesolithic foragers and fishers. Their tools were made of flint, their shelters were seasonal, and their lives left only faint geological whispers. No temples, no written records, no monuments to withstand the tides. The things they made were designed to be used, not remembered. And while their presence was real and lasting in their time, the archaeological half-life of a wooden spear or a woven basket in a floodplain is brutally short. What they created, the sea erased. Then there is the question of oral tradition. Stories, of course, were told. We know this from every surviving indigenous society. Humans narrate. We explain the sky, the animals, the land beneath our feet. But oral tradition requires continuity. It needs listeners, and it needs time. The people who fled Doggerland did not disappear, but their way of life did. Within a few centuries, their children and grandchildren had become part of new communities, new geographies, new weather patterns. The tales of the old land may have persisted for a while, in warnings, in metaphors, in dreams. But eventually, like the land itself, they faded into the background noise of survival. We also have to consider how humans construct memory. Most societies remember what is useful or sacred: a field for planting, a spring for water, a cave for burial. But Doggerland, once drowned, offered no such utility. It could not be returned to. It could not be used again. And without a mythological framework to pin it down, no sacred mountain, no wrathful gods, there was little reason to retain its image across generations. It became a thing not worth mentioning, a thing best left to the sea. By the time written history began to take hold in the ancient world, Doggerland had already been underwater for thousands of years. The earliest written geographies, those of the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans, were based on coastlines and rivers visible to the eye. There was no memory among them of a land bridge where the North Sea now rolled. Even in northern Europe, where oral traditions were strong, the mythology that emerged over the following millennia spoke mostly of fjords and forests, not of sunken plains. The sea was a boundary, not a grave. And so Doggerland passed into geological anonymity. It existed only as seabed, unmarked, unexplored, undisturbed. Generations sailed over it, fished above it, and built their maps without it. No one thought to ask why Britain was an island. No one questioned what lay beneath the waves. This was not a cover-up. It was not denial. It was simply absence. And absence in human history is remarkably good at becoming invisibility. It was not until the rise of modern science, particularly geology and marine mapping in the 18th and 19th centuries, that the first seeds of rediscovery were planted. Scientists began to notice strange underwater ridges and banks. They mapped the contours of the continental shelf. But even then, Doggerland was not yet a concept. It was just a curious feature. The idea that a lost land had once connected Britain to the continent still sounded like myth, not science. Memory is not just about what is remembered. It is about what is possible to remember. And for thousands of years, Doggerland was simply outside the realm of possibility. The very idea of sea levels rising and falling, of continents moving, of land appearing and disappearing over geological time, these were not notions available to pre-modern minds. Without the framework of Earth systems science, there was no cognitive scaffolding to imagine Doggerland back into being. It did not fit the story the world was telling about itself. And so it lingered beneath the waves, quiet and unmourned. Not because it was unimportant, but because it left no echo that could be heard with the tools of the time. It took sonar, core sampling, seismic imaging, and the collaboration of oceanographers, archaeologists, and paleoclimatologists to bring the outline of Doggerland back into focus. But that would not happen for many centuries more. There is a lesson here about the fragility of memory, and about how much of human history remains unread not because it is hidden, but because we have not yet learned how to see it. The people of Doggerland lived entire lives. They raised children. They hunted, fished, carved tools. They laughed and sang and told stories. But their world left no monuments. And in the absence of stone, memory needs something else to hold it up. When that scaffolding collapses, when land disappears, when languages shift, when generations scatter, memory dies quietly. Or maybe it just waits. Because Doggerland was not truly forgotten, it was only misplaced. Waiting for the right tools, waiting for the right questions, waiting for someone to ask, why is there peat and pollen at the bottom of the sea? Why is there a barbed spear in a fishing trawler's net? Why does the North Sea floor look like a river valley? The rediscovery of Doggerland is still ongoing, but the forgetting of Doggerland is, in some ways, just as important. It shows us how easy it is to lose whole chapters of our shared story, and how lucky we are when science is able to recover them. There is a reason headlines cannot resist it. Europe's Atlantis, the lost continent of the North, the real Atlantis beneath the waves. Doggerland, once a real landmass, now a scattered memory buried under meters of silt and salt, has been cast into the role of myth made flesh. But before we settle into the poetry of the comparison, it's worth asking, why? Why does every sunken shore echo with the name Atlantis? And more importantly, is it helping us understand Doggerland or distracting us from what really happened? To begin untangling this, we need to return to where it all started, Plato. Writing in the 4th century BCE, Plato claimed that Atlantis was a powerful island nation beyond the Pillars of Heracles, destroyed by cataclysm and swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars still debate whether he intended this as allegory or distant memory. But whatever Plato's purpose, Atlantis was never described as a Mesolithic land bridge or a forgotten archipelago. It was an idealized state, a stand-in for hubris, a mirror for Athens. Not a real place, not a scientific proposal. And yet, from that single origin story, Atlantis took on a life of its own. Across centuries, it absorbed every lost city, every vanished coast, every cultural mystery without a name. When a fisherman pulled up carved stone from a reef, it was Atlantis. When early explorers found submerged ruins off unfamiliar shores, it was Atlantis. By the 19th century, the myth had ballooned into a global catch-all, a speculative dumping ground for whatever archaeology couldn't explain. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being Plato's metaphor and became a kind of craving, a deep human desire to believe that somewhere beneath the water lies a better version of ourselves, ruined by fate, waiting to be reclaimed. Doggerland, however, resists that fantasy, and it should, because unlike Atlantis, Doggerland is not a mythological morality tale. It is not about divine punishment or ancient glory. It was a real land. It flooded slowly, and the people who lived on it were not some advanced proto-civilization with mysterious powers. They were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Their tools were practical. Their architecture was perishable. Their knowledge, real as it was, left no scrolls. To paint Doggerland in Atlantean hues is to overwrite the quiet truth of its disappearance with the noise of later invention. Still, there are echoes. And that's worth exploring, not to validate the Atlantis label, but to understand why it keeps appearing. Because myths of sunken lands are not unique to Plato. Cultures across the world tell stories of great floods, drowned lands, lost peoples. In Welsh tradition, there is 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒𝐿, a fertile land swallowed by the sea when a watchman failed to close the floodgates. In Breton legend, there is 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿, a city engulfed by waves as punishment for sin. The Irish speak of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿, a phantom island that appears once every 7 years. Even in Indian and Southeast Asian traditions, vast lands are described as lost to rising tides. Could some of these be cultural memories of real sea level rise? Possibly. After all, between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, coastlines changed dramatically. Ice melted, seas rose, and entire regions vanished. If oral traditions persisted across enough generations, it is not impossible that the memory of a vanishing shore became a myth. But Doggerland itself? There is no clear evidence. No Mesolithic narrative has survived intact. No preserved legend refers unmistakably to a land between Britain and Denmark. The cultural memory, if it existed, did not make it through the millennia in any way that archaeology has found. What makes Doggerland tempting, of course, is that it fits the emotional shape of Atlantis. A land lost, a population displaced, a transformation of geography so complete that later generations forgot what came before. It has all the ingredients of myth, except the myth itself. And that's where the caution must enter. Because archaeology is not in the business of fulfilling ancient stories. It is not confirmation for fairy tales. It is slow work, muddy work, work that often ends in uncertainty, not revelation. The risk in leaning too hard into the Atlantis narrative is twofold. First, it invites a kind of speculative slippage, where evidence is stretched to fit a story that already lives in our heads. And second, it places the wrong emphasis on what matters. Doggerland does not need pyramids or lost temples to be important. Its significance lies in what it reveals about climate, migration, survival, and loss. It teaches us not about a fallen utopia, but about the deep time of human geography and how easily the places we live can change. That said, the Atlantis comparison does do one useful thing. It gets attention, it sparks interest, and sometimes that's the doorway to deeper understanding. If calling Doggerland Europe's Atlantis helps someone discover paleogeography, or sea level science, or Mesolithic culture for the first time, then perhaps it serves a purpose. So long as we eventually step through the doorway and leave the metaphor behind. In truth, Doggerland is more haunting than Atlantis, because it is not wrapped in prophecy or sin. Its disappearance was not punishment, it was physics. Glaciers melted, seas rose, the ground subsided. There was no single day and night of disaster. There were centuries of erosion, of displacement, of adjustment, and maybe a tsunami at the end. But even that did not erase a civilization. It only erased a memory we were already losing. Atlantis is a story about what happens when power is misused. Doggerland is a story about what happens when the earth simply does what it does. One is a parable, the other is a puzzle made of pollen and bones. And that difference is important, because in the age of rising seas and shifting climates, we do not need more myths. We need to understand how landscapes respond, how people adapt, and what disappears when we stop listening to the land. So was Doggerland the real Atlantis? No. It was something quieter, something humbler, and in many ways, something far more human. A place that fed its people, a place that changed with the climate, a place that once connected islands and continents and now lies forgotten beneath the waves. Not cursed, not mythical, just gone. To most of us, archaeology brings to mind dry brush strokes on desert sand, sun-bleached bones peeking from baked earth, maybe an excavation grid pinned across some rocky hill. But none of that applies to Doggerland. This sunken continent, this drowned memory of Mesolithic Europe, is now buried beneath tens of meters of cold, shifting seawater, cloaked in centuries of marine sediment. There are no standing stones to find, no villages waiting under the soil. The land is gone. And yet, we know it was once full of life. So how do you study something that has vanished? How do you reconstruct a world that you cannot walk upon? The answer is through patient sediment, inventive technology, and the quiet persistence of science that is not afraid to get wet. The archaeology of the seafloor is a humbling kind of science. There are no grand monuments, no golden treasures, just mud, pollen, bones, and fragments of what once was. And for Doggerland, nearly all of what we know has been pieced together from the silt and clay brought up by core drills and trawler nets. The story of this place is being told not by temples or writing systems, but by peat deposits and shell fragments, by things so small and quiet they almost escaped notice. One of the key tools in this work is seismic mapping. When offshore energy companies began exploring the North Sea in the late 20th century, they needed to understand the geology beneath the seabed. So they fired acoustic pulses into the earth, sending vibrations downward to bounce off the various layers of sediment and rock. The echoes were recorded by sensors and processed into cross-sectional images of the hidden subsurface. It was meant to be an industrial mapping exercise, but for archaeologists, it opened a portal into the lost landscapes below. In these seismic scans, researchers began to see what looked like ancient river valleys, vast channels carved by freshwater long before the sea moved in. They found former coastlines, delta systems, and even signs of ancient lakes, all preserved in the buried contours of what was once dry land. What began as commercial geophysics became an accidental act of resurrection. Slowly, the geography of Doggerland began to reappear, but seismic data alone can only suggest shape and structure. To find traces of the people who lived there, you have to go further. That is where sediment cores come in. A coring device is lowered to the seabed, pushed or drilled into the mud, and then retrieved with a long cylindrical sample of the substrate. It sounds simple. It is anything but. These cores are like time machines. Each centimeter represents hundreds or thousands of years of geological history. Within them, scientists look for layers of peat, pollen grains, charcoal fragments, and microscopic diatoms, clues that can tell us what kind of plants grew there, what the climate was like, and when freshwater systems gave way to saltwater intrusions. From these humble mud tubes, we've learned that Doggerland was once a vast plain with low-lying wetlands, dense woodlands, and winding rivers. The pollen record tells us that hazel, oak, birch, and elm once dominated the landscape. Charcoal layers hint at possible human-made fires. Peat layers reveal the march of marshlands across once dry soil. And in some cases, bones emerge. Not often, but enough. Most of what we know about the human side of Doggerland comes not from intact sites but from isolated finds, tools, bones, and artifacts dredged up by fishing trawlers or offshore construction. This is, frankly, a frustrating way to do archaeology. The context is missing. A harpoon tip means little if we do not know where it lay. A human femur becomes harder to interpret if we do not know what surrounded it. This lack of context makes underwater archaeology a cautious business. We are not here to tell myths or invent stories. We are here to observe patterns and trace fragments back to the ecological and cultural realities that produced them. One of the most remarkable finds was a piece of human skull dredged up from the seabed and dated to between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago. This fragment, dubbed Kreen, belonged to a young Neanderthal male and remains the first known Neanderthal fossil recovered from under the North Sea. It tells us that this land was walked not only by Homo sapiens, but by their evolutionary cousins long before history began. The isotopic analysis of Kreen's skull even hinted at a diet rich in meat, possibly marine animals, suggesting an adaptive coastal strategy not always associated with Neanderthals. A single fragment, dredged by chance, raised whole new questions. Beyond bones, some of the most useful evidence comes from paleobotany, the study of ancient plant remains. In Doggerland's submerged soils, researchers have recovered fossilized seeds, leaf impressions, and even preserved wood. These are not glamorous finds, but they are foundational. They tell us what the Mesolithic forest looked like, how the climate shifted, and how people may have navigated their environment. The wood itself has even been used to model the types of trees that ancient people may have used to make tools, boats, or shelters. And then there is the faintest, most modern trace of all, DNA. In recent years, scientists have begun to extract ancient environmental DNA from seafloor sediments. These are not long strands of human genome. They are microscopic traces of life left behind in soil and water: hair, skin cells, feces, pollen. With the right techniques, these tiny fragments can be analyzed to reconstruct ecosystems. A teaspoon of mud can tell us what animals lived in a certain area thousands of years ago. This technology is still in its infancy, but it has already confirmed the presence of red deer, aurochs, and various fish species in submerged zones. Eventually, it may tell us more about the people too. Marine archaeology is a slow, indirect kind of science. It relies on proxy data, probabilistic modeling, and careful interpretation of clues that are often separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years. It demands humility. We do not get to stand above a ruin and look down into the past. We get to squint into a microscope or scroll through seismic charts, trying to decipher meaning from mud. And even then, the gaps are enormous. Still, the cumulative picture is growing sharper. Digital reconstructions now allow scientists to model what Doggerland may have looked like in 3 dimensions. Using topographic modeling, river mapping, and vegetation data, researchers have created maps of the Mesolithic world that once stretched from Britain to Denmark. In these maps, you can see ancient estuaries, floodplains, and even suspected zones of seasonal human activity. None of it is definitive. All of it is careful. And perhaps that's the real value of this kind of archaeology. It reminds us that knowledge is not about certainty. It is about reconstruction, doubt, and refinement. Doggerland will never be fully known. Its settlements, if they ever existed in durable form, are gone. Its people left no writing. Its monuments were made of wood, or nothing at all. But the seabed still whispers. And if we listen closely, if we keep drilling, mapping, filtering, and modeling, a story continues to emerge. In a way, This is one of the most honest chapters in the human saga. A land lost, not to war or disaster alone, but to time, tide, and planetary change. A place that mattered, even though it left so little behind. And the scientists working today, mud-smeared, data-soaked, half-drowned in sonar and sediment, are the caretakers of that memory. What they recover will never be complete. But it will be true, piece by piece. And that, in the end, might be all that history ever is. Not the grand tales of kings and battles, but the careful stitching together of what we can still find, in the hope of remembering what almost vanished forever. Under the North Sea lies not just a vanished land, but an entire chapter of human ancestry that we are only beginning to glimpse. Doggerland was not simply terrain, it was habitat, corridor, memory. But it did not fossilize its people in the way desert tombs might. The bones are rare, and the camps ephemeral. For decades, that seemed like the end of the trail. Then came the genomic revolution. In the last 10 years, science has begun whispering directly to the dead, not through their monuments or their tools, but through the biological code they left behind in teeth, in petrous bones, in the sediments they slept in. And from that DNA, we are now asking one of the most intimate questions in the entire Doggerland story. Can we meet the people who lived there? Can we hear the echo of their blood? Ancient DNA is fragile. It decays quickly in warm, wet conditions, which makes Doggerland a terrible preservation environment. Submerged for more than 8,000 years, with saltwater intrusion and high microbial activity, most organic material is long gone. But Doggerland was vast, and its fringes extended into drier lands now above water, in Britain, the Low Countries, Denmark. In those surrounding soils and tombs, fragments of the story may still linger, and in the last decade, researchers have begun assembling what amounts to a genetic perimeter around Doggerland, looking for echoes in the genomes of those who lived nearby. From burial sites in Britain dated to around 8,000 to 6,000 BCE, DNA has been extracted from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who likely once walked the forests and wetlands of Doggerland. These individuals often carry genetic signatures shared with other Western European forager populations, but with subtle variations that hint at regional structure, founder effects, drift, and ancient isolation before the waters came. Some individuals from Cheddar Gorge and other early British sites show strong continuity with populations from the Low Countries and Denmark, suggesting Doggerland was not a boundary, but a bridge. Genes flowed across it, just as herds and families once did. But we must be cautious. DNA cannot yet say precisely where someone lived. It can suggest ancestry, kinship networks, population movement, but it cannot pinpoint whether a specific lineage came from Dogger Island or from the floodplains of Belgium. There is no DNA sample yet that says, "I was from Doggerland." Instead, we see its ghost in the diffusion patterns of haplogroups, trails that scatter across modern Europe, faint and braided. In Scandinavia, for example, some lineages once attributed to Neolithic farmers now appear to have deeper, older origins in Mesolithic Western foragers, including those associated with Doggerland's western shores. Perhaps most tantalizing of all is the emerging use of environmental DNA, or eDNA. This is not human bone or fossil. It is microscopic traces of life left behind in soil and sediment, shed skin, feces, degraded tissue. In the North Sea basin, researchers have begun recovering eDNA from sediment cores. While most of it so far represents animal and plant life, aurochs, fish, pollen, there is cautious hope that human signatures may eventually be found. The technology is improving. The contamination risks are being managed. If we one day find a fragment of mitochondrial DNA nestled in a Holocene peat layer below the sea, we may be able to say with greater certainty that someone stood there, fished there, raised a child there. Not just a Homo sapiens, but an individual, anchored in place and time. This growing field is forcing a quiet reckoning between archaeology and genetics. The two do not always agree. Radiocarbon dates can contradict molecular clocks. Artifact style does not always match ancestral lineage. And some archaeologists worry that DNA risks flattening complex cultural mosaics into simple migratory arrows. A genome can tell you where your grandmother's people came from. It cannot tell you what songs they sang, what gods they feared, what stories they told as the sea crept in. We must not mistake blood for culture or genes for experience. They are different kinds of evidence. but together they are stronger than either alone. In the case of Doggerland, what DNA offers is possibility. It lets us ask, what if? What if this particular group of Western foragers, whose bones lie near the Thames, was part of a broader population that once ranged across the now submerged plain? What if a distinctive genetic marker in a Danish Mesolithic burial points back not to the north but to the sunken southwest? These are not answers, but they are directions, hypotheses, starting points for new digs, new cores, new collaborations between labs and divers and geophysicists. There is also the quiet, ongoing work of mapping ancient population structure. Studies in the last few years have suggested that Mesolithic Europe was not genetically uniform. Instead, it was a patchwork of microregions, each with its own mix of lineages. Doggerland, by virtue of its size and central position, may have been a genetic meeting ground, a place where groups from the Atlantic West, the Baltic North, and the continental interior came together. If true, its flooding may have erased not just a landscape, but a hub of genetic and cultural exchange. The sea did not just drown a landmass, it scrambled a network. In modern Europeans, traces of those ancient Doggerland-linked foragers persist. They are faint, diluted by waves of migration that followed. The Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, the Bronze Age herders from the steppe, the Romans, the Vikings. But in the deepest layers of our genetic code, in the background hum of shared ancestry, the signal is still there. A quiet inheritance from people whose homes were swept away but whose children survived somewhere else, inland, uphill, or across the narrowing channels. In the end, ancient DNA does not resurrect. It whispers. It reminds us that every burial, every tooth, every sediment sample is a chance to look backwards with care and forwards with responsibility. Doggerland's people are not lost entirely. They echo in the blood of living Europeans, in the shared immunities, the pigmentation genes, the subtle alleles linked to metabolism and adaptation to climate. These are not heroic legacies. They are ordinary, biological ones, which makes them all the more profound. Perhaps the most humbling realization in all of this is that Doggerland's disappearance was not the end of its story. It simply moved into genomes, into language, into the stories of people who remembered the flood even if they forgot the land. And now, with sequencers humming and cores being drilled, with teeth being ground and genomes being mapped, we are beginning to remember again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to say that they were here. Enough to say that we are, in part, them. Underneath one of the busiest shipping corridors in the world lies a memory most of us never knew we had. Doggerland is now a ghostly name for what was once Europe's lush green heart, a land that joined Britain to the continent, sustained tens of thousands of humans, and disappeared not with mythic fire or divine punishment, but with water. As the sea crept in, first slowly, then suddenly, it erased not just fields and rivers, but homes, paths, identities. That should feel distant, but it doesn't. Not anymore. Because we too are living on a warming planet. We too are watching the sea rise. And the story of Doggerland, reconstructed from mud, bone, and sonar, now raises a simple and unsettling question. What can a drowned Stone Age continent teach a modern world teetering on the edge of its own flood? Start with this. Doggerland did not vanish all at once. Its disappearance took thousands of years. It was not a catastrophe in the Hollywood sense. No single night swallowed it whole. There were no sirens, no news reports. What happened instead was something quieter and more insidious, a series of pulses, a long melt, then a surge, a pause, then another. Sea levels rose by tens of meters over millennia, driven by the collapse of ancient ice sheets and complicated by tectonics, sedimentation, and global ocean dynamics. That kind of change is hard for any human society to track, let alone respond to. There were no maps, no government alerts, just forests turning to marshes, campsites vanishing under the tide, rivers shifting course, the coastline moving inland year after year until it became a memory, then a myth, then nothing. This pattern of slow loss punctuated by rapid events, whether tsunamis, storms, or sudden inundation, feels eerily familiar. Today, our coastlines are also retreating, though this time we know it. Satellites measure the melt of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets in centimeters per year. Sea levels have already risen more than 20 centimeters since the late 19th century, and projections suggest at least another half-meter by the end of the 21st. That may sound modest, but so did the early flooding of Doggerland. And like those ancient shorelines, ours are not disappearing uniformly. Some cities are sinking faster than the water is rising. Others are held back only by walls and pumps, a kind of stubborn defiance against gravity and time. The difference is that we have the data. We have the charts. We know, almost to the year, what will happen if emissions continue, if temperatures rise, if ice sheets reach their tipping points. But knowledge does not always translate to action. And here, Doggerland offers a second, subtler lesson. Awareness does not guarantee response. It's possible, perhaps likely, that the people living on the final islands of Doggerland saw the waters coming. They may have marked the rising tides, shifted their settlements, built higher, traveled farther inland. But in the end, they could not hold the sea back. They could only leave. Adaptation, in their world, meant movement. But in ours, borders are harder, cities more static. We have infrastructure, economies, politics. Leaving is not so simple, nor is staying. In that sense, Doggerland is not just a historical curiosity. It is a case study in vulnerability, a reminder that even rich, fertile, thriving places, filled with life and culture and meaning, can be undone by environmental change. Not because the people were primitive or incapable, but because the change outpaced what their world could absorb. Today we have more tools, but our exposure is also greater. More than 600 million people live in coastal zones vulnerable to flooding. Cities like Jakarta, Miami, and Dhaka face chronic inundation within decades. Entire island nations like Tuvalu and the Maldives may become uninhabitable in the lifetime of children born today. And while the causes are different, our current sea level rise is driven primarily by human-induced climate change. The outcomes rhyme. We are watching landscapes disappear, watching ecosystems fragment, watching people displaced not from war or famine, but from water. This is not theoretical. It is measurable. Already, saltwater intrusion is affecting agriculture in coastal deltas. Flooding is displacing families from Louisiana to Bangladesh. Insurance markets are collapsing in flood-prone regions. Governments are debating whether to build walls, raise homes, or retreat altogether. Yet the stories we tell about this change often feel either apocalyptic or sterile. Charts and warnings, dystopias and denials. What Doggerland offers is something quieter but more profound. A human past where sea level rise was not a prophecy, but a memory. Where loss did not come all at once but still came. Where adaptation happened, but not fast enough to stop the map from changing. And perhaps most powerfully, where the memory of the land itself faded so completely that it had to be rediscovered by accident on the rusty prongs of a fishing trawler centuries later. That rediscovery, and the science it sparked, is part of how we are now beginning to tell a different kind of climate story, one rooted not only in the future, but in the deep past. A story where geology and archaeology, glaciology and sediment cores collaborate to remind us that Earth has changed before, that it will change again, that some losses are inevitable, but also that how we understand those losses, how we narrate them, teach them, plan around them, can shape the resilience of what comes next. Some researchers now argue that we are in a new epoch, the Anthropocene, a period where human activity is the dominant force shaping planetary systems. In that frame, Doggerland is not just a victim of natural forces, but a warning. Because while its drowning was driven by natural deglaciation, ours is not. The ice is melting faster now because of us. The warming is accelerating, the feedback loops are compounding, and the timelines are shrinking. But panic is not the only response. Doggerland also shows that life continues, that even after the forests sank and the rivers widened into sea, people survived. They moved, they adapted, they changed. The Mesolithic gave way to the Neolithic. Fishing gave way to farming. The coastlines hardened into nations. Culture evolved, language diversified. The drowned land disappeared, but its people did not. That is not a happy ending, but it is not despair either. It is continuity, which is perhaps the best we can hope for now. To be clear, Doggerland is not a one-to-one analogy for modern climate risk. We have more people, more complexity, more tools, and more responsibility. But that is what makes it such a powerful lens. It strips away the illusion that land is permanent, that coasts are fixed, that loss only happens in other places to other people. It shows that vulnerability is a human constant, but so is adaptation, and that forgetting the past only makes us more fragile in the present. In recent years, Doggerland has begun to appear in policy circles, museum exhibits, and climate education programs, not as a cautionary tale, but as a way to humanize the abstract. A map of memory that links prehistoric loss to modern risk, a place that once was and now is not, and may yet help shape how we navigate what comes next. We will not stop the sea from rising, but we may still decide how we respond, whether we retreat or resist, whether we adapt with foresight or react with regret, whether we remember Doggerland not just as a name on a sonar map, but as a lesson written in sediment, in silence, in the long erosion of memory. And if that lesson holds, if the past can whisper loud enough, we may yet find that our own flood story ends differently, not with vanishing, but with learning. Beneath the spinning turbines of the Doggerbank wind farm, one of the largest offshore renewable energy projects on Earth, lies a drowned continent that no one remembered until it was already gone. It is hard not to see the irony. Here, in the 21st century, we are planting steel towers into the seabed where Mesolithic hunters once tracked red deer. Cables snake through ancient riverbeds. Anchors rest on what may have been villages. The wind we now harvest for electricity is the same wind that once rippled across grasslands, ruffled aurochs hides, and pushed dugout canoes through the shallow marshes of a world that no longer exists. This is Doggerland's strange afterlife, a Stone Age homeland turned power plant. And it raises a quiet but profound question. Is this continuity or erasure? Progress or poetry? Or both? The Doggerbank wind farm began construction in the 2010s and is scheduled for full operation in the 2030s. It will power millions of homes in Britain. It represents a crucial step in the transition away from fossil fuels. And in many ways, it is a triumph of engineering over adversity. The North Sea is not gentle. The turbines must withstand waves, salt, corrosion, and shifting sands. But as the planning expanded, so did awareness of what lay below. Before each turbine was placed, marine archaeologists were consulted. Sediment cores were drilled. Sonar scans combed the seabed for artifacts. Because this was not just sea, it was once land, and it had memory. What they found was subtle, not monuments, not cities, but fragments. Bones, flints, peat lenses, pollen grains trapped in clay. These are not dramatic finds. They do not change the course of history, but they change our relationship to it, because they remind us that the landscapes we consider empty are not. That every technological step forward might rest, quite literally, on the remnants of lives we barely understand. That history is not just something we study, it is something we stand on. This theme takes on deeper resonance when we consider one of the more audacious proposals of our era, the North European Enclosure Dam. First proposed in 2020 by Dutch scientists as a thought experiment, it would involve building massive seawalls across the English Channel and the northern edge of the North Sea, effectively turning parts of the ocean back into land, or at least shielding low-lying areas from rising seas. It is unlikely to happen. The scale is immense, the cost astronomical, the political will absent. But the idea itself is telling. In the face of rising water, some human instincts remain unchanged. Reclaim the land, draw lines against the flood, fight the sea. That is, in a way, what Doggerland's final inhabitants may have done in their own time. Retreated inland, rebuilt farther up the slope, tracked the shorelines as they moved. But they lacked the tools, and the numbers were small. Today, we can move megatons of concrete. We can simulate storm surges decades in advance. We can engineer our way out of some consequences, or so we believe. But what Doggerland's fate reminds us is that not all battles against nature are winnable. Sometimes adaptation is not resistance, it is memory. In the 21st century, we now face a paradox. We are building the future on top of the forgotten past. Wind farms to power cities that may themselves be threatened by the same forces that once drowned Doggerland. Flood defenses along coastlines that, without intervention, will look very different within decades. And yet, the memory of Doggerland has returned. It is not myth. It is science. It is now baked into environmental assessments, taught in museums, referenced in climate policy. This is not nothing. It may be the most important kind of remembrance, not nostalgic, but useful. The United Kingdom's planning for offshore infrastructure now routinely includes archaeological surveys, not out of romance but responsibility. Because every borehole could uncover ancient footprints, every trench might disturb the last traces of lives lived long before writing. This forces a kind of humility, a recognition that we are not the first to live here, nor the last to be erased. And this raises a cultural question too. What kind of memory do we owe a place like Doggerland? Is it enough to acknowledge it in scientific reports and environmental statements? Or should it enter our wider narratives, our films, our literature, our art, not as Atlantis, not as myth, but as history, as a lens through which to see our own moment more clearly? Some museums have tried this. The Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in the Netherlands, the British Museum's exhibits on prehistoric Britain, educational documentaries. But public awareness still lags. To most people, Doggerland is a name they've never heard. Perhaps that will change. As more of the seabed is mapped, as more projects are built, as sea levels continue to rise, the ghost of Doggerland may grow louder. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a human one. A drowned homeland is not something to romanticize, it is something to learn from. To integrate into the way we talk about progress, energy, sustainability. Because it reminds us that the land itself is not eternal. That what we build now must contend not only with the present, but with the deep past and the deeper future. It is poetic, then, that green energy, born of our attempt to reduce emissions and slow sea level rise, should now spin above a place once lost to water. It is also a little unsettling. The turbines are not monuments, they are machines, and while they help fight climate change, they do not remember. That is our task. To see the land beneath the sea not just as resource, but as record, not just as a platform for power, but as a library without words. And there are deeper implications still. One of the most striking aspects of Doggerland is its invisibility. It left behind no temples, no kings, no writing, just pollen and peat, bones and flint. It was forgotten because it could be. And in a world obsessed with speed and novelty, many such places still slip away unnoticed. Rising seas today may drown towns in Bangladesh, the Pacific, or Louisiana. Will we remember them? Will we learn from them? Or will they too become sonar readings and sediment cores? In the end, Doggerland's value is not just archaeological, it is philosophical. It challenges the assumption that progress always means permanence, that the future is a straight line forward. It forces us to admit that even the most familiar coastlines are temporary, that our homes are borrowed from time, that resilience is not the absence of loss, but the ability to see through it, live with it, and build again, carefully, humbly, and with memory. So yes, it is poetic, and a little dystopian, and profoundly human. We are building wind farms on the bones of a lost land, but we are also telling its story, and that perhaps is the most powerful kind of energy we can harness, the kind that lights the mind, not just the grid. In the spring of 2020, a group of Dutch scientists proposed something that sounded more like science fiction than science, the North European Enclosure Dam. The plan, outlined in a climate journal, was breathtaking in scale. Imagine building one dam from the northern tip of Scotland across to western Norway, then another across the English Channel from southwest England to northwest France, seal off the entire North Sea from the Atlantic, stop the rising tides, protect the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany and Denmark, and, as a strange side effect, drain much of what had once been Doggerland. Not just prevent further loss, but, possibly, reclaim what was already gone. This was never meant as a serious construction blueprint. It was a thought experiment, a way to visualize what kind of engineering it would take to preserve low-lying Europe in the face of unchecked climate change. But the idea stuck, because it tapped into something deeper. The ancient human desire to undo what time has done, to reclaim not just land, but memory. Technically, could we do it? In some form, perhaps. The Dutch have a long history of building land where there was none. Their polders are modern miracles of dikes, pumps, and engineering stubbornness. The United Arab Emirates have shaped islands in the sea purely for real estate spectacle. Singapore expands its territory with sand dredged from other nations' coasts, so reclaiming parts of the southern North Sea is not impossible. But Doggerland is not a flat, empty basin. It is a complex marine ecosystem. Its topography has changed. Its sediments have shifted for thousands of years. Any serious effort to drain it would mean more than building walls. It would mean managing salinity, silt, erosion, species collapse. It would mean essentially terraforming a seafloor that no longer remembers being dry. But let's say, for the sake of exploration, we could do it. What then? What do you call land raised from the sea where people lived 10,000 years ago? Is it new land? Is it a national territory, a nature reserve, a memorial, a tourist site, a museum? The answer, of course, is that we do not know, because nothing like this has been done. And that is what makes the question worth asking. Not because we should do it, but because thinking through it forces us to clarify our relationship with the past. What is the purpose of remembering Doggerland? Is it to recover something lost, or to learn why it was lost? There is another layer here too, a moral one. If we had the ability to re-expose this land, to drain it, dig it, walk on it, what obligations would come with that power? Would we treat it like a construction site, a frontier for development and profit? Or would we move carefully, acknowledging that every square meter could hold artifacts, burials, ecological records we cannot recover elsewhere? In a sense, the sea has preserved Doggerland by making it hard to touch. What would we lose by making it accessible again? Cultural archaeologists have raised this question in other contexts. Think of the debate over melting glaciers in the Alps revealing Bronze Age and Neolithic objects. These finds are priceless, but they are also a kind of tragedy. We only get them because the ice is disappearing. The very process that gives us access destroys what was preserving them. Doggerland presents a similar dilemma in reverse. If we drained it, we might gain proximity but lose context. Archaeology works best when the layers are undisturbed. Mud does not forget, but bulldozers do. Some futurists suggest another approach, not physical reclamation, but virtual. Reconstruct Doggerland in digital space. Use seismic data, sediment cores, paleoecological records, and known artifacts to create immersive models. Let people walk through simulated landscapes that no longer exist. Museums have started experimenting with this. Augmented reality exhibitions where you can stand on a modern beach and see what it might have looked like 10,000 years ago. Educational games, animated documentaries. These efforts are not about fantasy, they are about empathy, helping modern humans feel what it might have meant to live on a land that slowly vanished beneath your feet. Even this, though, carries ethical weight. If we recreate Doggerland, who do we imagine lived there? Are they nameless silhouettes? Do we romanticize them as noble foragers? Do we overlay our own ideas of simplicity and purity onto their lives? These are the same concerns that trouble all representations of the deep past. Because the further back we go, the easier it is to project. Doggerland has no myths of its own. No oral traditions survived, no writing, just bones and pollen and stone. That silence can invite either reverence or appropriation. Both are understandable. Neither is fully accurate. There is another way to think about this. Instead of asking whether we should raise Doggerland, we might ask, what does it mean to live above it now? Because in truth, we already do. Not just literally, in the case of turbines and trawlers and oil platforms, but culturally. Doggerland is part of the modern European psyche now, a reminder that the continent has never been fixed, that land bridges came and went, that identities and borders are newer than the mud below the sea, that our sense of permanence is a mirage. This is what makes Doggerland so compelling. It is not just a drowned place, it is a concept, a pressure point, a portal into how we think about deep time and human scale. And that is where its real power lies. Not in whether we could bring it back, but in how its loss reshapes our view of the present. We tend to think of climate change as something new, something unprecedented, and in many ways it is. But the Earth has drowned coasts before. Entire worlds have vanished. What is different now is our awareness, our tools, our numbers, our stakes. To raise Doggerland would be an act of defiance, or of hubris, or of tribute, perhaps all three. But even entertaining the possibility reveals something useful, that we do not think of the past as finished, that memory is not static, that land, even when submerged, retains meaning, and that sometimes imagining impossible things is how we sharpen our moral clarity. Doggerland will almost certainly remain underwater. It is more valuable as metaphor than as territory. But the fact that we now dream about it says something about the time we live in. Because to imagine raising the past is also to ask, what are we leaving behind now, unnoticed? What lowlands today will be silt and sonar in 10,000 years? And what will future humans wonder about us? Will they try to reconstruct our coasts, our cities, our stories? Will they question our myths? Or will they too wonder whether anything should be brought back? Doggerland is gone, but it is also here, in core samples, in turbine anchors, in speculative engineering diagrams, in cultural conversations. It has become one of the most powerful historical metaphors in Europe, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so ordinary. It was home, it was lost, and now it is idea. If, by some miraculous feat of geoengineering or continental tectonic reversal, the North Sea were to drain and Doggerland were to rise from its shallow grave, what exactly would we find? It is tempting to imagine a lost continent frozen in time, as if its final moments were preserved beneath the mud like Pompeii beneath volcanic ash. But Doggerland did not vanish in an instant. It eroded, collapsed, and gradually drowned. So what survives when a place disappears over millennia rather than minutes? And what would we even recognize if we were to walk that resurrected land? The first layer we would encounter would be geological, not cultural. Sandbanks, mudflats, ancient riverbeds now hardened into seabed scars. The rivers that once braided across this lost world, the Thames, the Rhine, the Elbe, would have left wide floodplains, carved valleys, and perhaps the meandering signatures of oxbow lakes. We would see the imprint of water long gone, ancient shorelines etched like wrinkles into the landscape. This would not be a place frozen in time, but a palimpsest, a geological manuscript written over and over by glaciers, floods, and tides, a place that remembers more than one story, layered and overwritten. Beneath that landscape might lie campsites, not towns, not cities, but small temporary camps, scattered tools, fire pits, a flint core beside a cracked mammoth rib, a scatter of charcoal where someone once boiled mussels. In some places, organic remains might be better preserved than anything we've recovered on land. Peat bogs are excellent at keeping secrets. Where oxygen is limited, time moves differently. Textiles, footprints, wooden structures, these are possible, if not likely. And if we're lucky, we might find caches of DNA embedded in bones, teeth, or even sediment. But even this is a cautious hope. The North Sea is not cold enough to be a freezer, nor is it calm enough to be a vault. Still, the idea persists that somewhere under that mud, is a story we do not yet know. Perhaps a burial, or a ritual site, or a rare moment when a Mesolithic community left behind something intentional, a monument of sorts. Not in stone, but in placement. A ring of posts, a carved antler, an arrangement of animal bones that told a story in a language now extinct. It is easy to romanticize, but archaeology is grounded in fragments, in uncertainty. The truth is, we would likely find more questions than answers, more eroded half-clues than preserved wholes. Some scientists dream of a central plateau, what researchers call Dogger Island, that may have stood above the rising waters for centuries longer than the surrounding lowlands. If anything was meant to last, it may have been there. The final hearth fires, the last seasonal gathering, or, more bleakly, a deserted hilltop where nobody remained. If Dogger Island was still occupied during the time of the Tsunami, as some models suggest, then perhaps the last people to see this land as dry also saw it vanish violently. But what would survive a wave of that size? The evidence may be broken, scattered, pushed inland or downslope. What we would find may not be where we expect to find it. Speculative archaeology is a careful exercise. It is not licensed to fantasize. It is a method of hypothesis, based on data, grounded in known behavior, but unconfirmed. So when we imagine returning to Doggerland, it is not to dream of Atlantean temples or sunken citadels. It is to reconstruct the lives of people who likely never thought of themselves as living in a disappearing world. Their story is told through mundane things: a barbed antler spear dredged from a trawler net, a pollen trace from submerged peat, a scattering of burnt hazelnut shells. This is the language of memory in prehistory. Quiet, unobvious, but deeply human. There may also be things we would not expect. In recent decades, archaeologists have started to find anomalies in sediment cores that hint at concentrated human activity: elevated phosphorus levels, unusual charcoal deposits, micro-artifacts embedded in soil. If more cores were taken systematically across the region, we might begin to see a pattern. Not just isolated occupation, but interconnectedness, travel routes, shared resource sites, perhaps even evidence of environmental management, seasonal burning, tree clearing, wetland use. These would be small, almost invisible fingerprints, but they would suggest a level of intentionality we rarely attribute to people without pottery or writing. Then there is the absence, the things we hope to find but never will. Structures made of bone or bark, languages that left no echo, social customs we cannot decode from toolkits. If Doggerland had any oral traditions, they are long gone. If it had music, it is silent. If it had stories, they are not ours to know. That is the humility built into this kind of research. The recognition that most of the past is not waiting to be uncovered. It is gone. And yet, we still try. Not because we expect completion, but because even partial memory matters. Would there be any surprises? Always. The past is rarely predictable. In southern Scandinavia, waterlogged sites have preserved dugout canoes and fishing traps thousands of years old. In Denmark, entire Mesolithic coastlines have yielded footprints, tools, and animal bones in perfect stratigraphy. So it is not unreasonable to think that somewhere under the North Sea, in just the right anaerobic layer, there might be something we have never seen before. A preserved child burial, a wooden carving, a plant species not yet catalogued. These are not guarantees. They are provocations, reasons to keep looking. If Doggerland rose again, it would also challenge our institutions. Who would have jurisdiction over this new land? Britain, the Netherlands, Germany? Would it be parceled out like any other resource zone, or would it be treated as a heritage site of shared European importance? These are not archaeological questions, but they matter, because how we govern the land shapes what kind of research can happen, and what kind of memory we allow ourselves to recover. More broadly, we might ask what it means to return to a place that was never ours. We, the moderns, have no ancestral claim to Doggerland. Its last inhabitants were distant cousins. Their genes are diluted into many lineages. Their culture is untraceable. So this would not be a homecoming. It would be a visitation, a respectful intrusion into a world that did not expect to be remembered. And perhaps that, more than any artifact, is what we would learn. That some of the most important histories are not those recorded, but those rediscovered. In the end, Doggerland is both loss and presence. It exists as sediment, as sonar blip, as whispered hypothesis in academic journals. If we could walk it again, it would not be a resurrection. It would be a confrontation with the limits of knowledge, with the fragility of culture, with the scale of time, and perhaps with ourselves. There is no monument to the last human who walked across Doggerland, no burial marked their passing, no story was written, no lament preserved in song. The place itself did not have a name, at least not one we know. And yet something about this lost land keeps tugging at the modern imagination. A sunken plain that left behind no cities, no temples, no carved stones. A place that never saw a wheel, a pyramid, or a war. But for some reason, it still feels familiar, perhaps even personal. The question is why? Maybe it begins with absence. Doggerland is a story told through loss, through what is not there, through what cannot be touched or photographed or held in a museum. It is an archaeology of longing, a map shaped by erasure. And that kind of silence, geological, historical, human, is not easy to ignore, because somewhere inside all of us is the understanding that memory is fragile, that landscapes can vanish, and with them, everything that once made them meaningful. To study Doggerland is to look into the hollow left behind when memory fails to take root in stone. But this story is also about scale, the kind of time that does not bend to us, the kind of change that moves too slowly for a single life to notice and then too fast for a culture to adapt. When the sea rose over Doggerland, it did not ask permission. It did not leave a border or a warning. It simply came, centimeter by centimeter, century by century. Then, sometimes, all at once. That is the timeline of grief in deep time, a slow unfolding, a sudden crash, a permanent forgetting. It mirrors the way we process loss in our own lives. First denial, then adaptation, then absence so total it begins to feel normal. Until someone stirs the silt and finds an antler spear. Doggerland reminds us that everything we build, everything we name, can be unmade, not through fire or conquest, but through silence, through erosion, through the indifference of the Earth's systems. This is not a moral story. There was no villain, just meltwater and gravity. But that is precisely what makes it unsettling, because it tells us that we too are temporary, that what feels permanent, shorelines, identities, borders, is, in the end, provisional. And yet this vanishing did not take the people with it. Their descendants live on. Their DNA continues, diffused, unnamed, in modern populations across northern Europe. Their tools resurface, dull with time but still sharp enough to slice through layers of forgetting. Their campsites re-emerge as seismic blurs, sediment cores, and sonar scatter. There are echoes of their presence in everything from the genes of modern Britons to the hazelnuts cracked open in Mesolithic fire pits preserved in modern Denmark. It is not enough to say they are gone. It is more honest to say they left no ending. Just the middle of a story we picked up too late. There is something intimate about that kind of mystery. Unlike the lost temples of ancient empires, Doggerland does not dazzle with grandeur. It whispers. It does not demand awe. It invites empathy. These were people without cities, without writing, without even the illusion of permanence. And yet they endured. For thousands of years, they adapted to rivers that changed course, coasts that advanced, skies that darkened. Their lives were short and likely hard, but never meaningless. The proof is in the persistence of their culture. Even as their land shrank, their story widened, across Britain, across the continent, into the forager lineages that would one day become our own. To imagine the last human on Doggerland is not to chase tragedy. It is to reflect on continuity, that even in disappearance, there is survival, that a landscape can flood and still leave footprints on the people who left it behind, that a name never spoken aloud can still echo in the bones of its former inhabitants. And perhaps that is why Doggerland haunts us, not because it is a lost paradise, but because it feels like something we almost remember, like a dream our ancestors forgot to pass down, but that our DNA somehow still carries. This haunting is not ghostly. It is geological. It is sedimentary. It is encoded in the way we think about land, about belonging, about what it means to lose something no one alive can recall. Doggerland becomes a mirror, not of the past, but of us, of what we assume is safe, of what we forget to remember, of what it means to be human in a world that never promised to stay the same. We are the only species that tells stories about things that no longer exist. We build meaning into what is gone. We give weight to absence. That is the strange magic of being human. To grieve a land we never saw. To feel nostalgia for a place with no name. To turn drowned continents into metaphors and barbed spears into symbols of survival. This is not a weakness. It is our superpower. To tell stories so long they outlive the land itself. In the end, Doggerland was never truly forgotten. It was buried, misplaced, erased by slow tides and fast storms. But now, in the age of seismic mapping and ancient DNA, we are learning to remember it differently. Not as a mythical Atlantis, but as a real place where real people lived and died, where they fished and walked and lit fires and told stories of their own. We will never know those stories, but we can write ours in response. And maybe that is the most haunting truth of all, that history is not what happened. It is what we choose to see in the silence. In the end, Britain did not choose to be an island. It simply became one, slowly, then all at once, Over centuries and then hours, over high tides and low fog, the landmass that once tethered it to the continent was unstitched by ice and water and time. This wasn't an exit negotiated in Parliament. It was a drift, quiet and irreversible. A tectonic shrug, a slow-motion unraveling of a once continuous plain called Doggerland. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is that no one really noticed it happening. No border posts were erected, no flags were lowered, no ceremonies were held. The land simply walked away and took its memory with it. Britain had once been a peninsula, not an island, a western arm of the continent, a place woven into the rivers and migrations of Ice Age Europe, back when the Thames was just another branch of a greater river network flowing into a plain now drowned. In those early millennia, the idea of being separate didn't exist. You could walk from what we now call the Netherlands to what we now call Norfolk. There was no English Channel, just marshes, estuaries, woodlands, mammoth paths, and human trails that crossed without needing boats or borders. It was not a breakaway state. It was just another piece of the puzzle. But as the sea rose, the story changed. By 6,000 years before the present, the land bridge was gone. Dogger Island had shrunk to silence, and Britain stood alone, or floated alone, depending on how you want to phrase it. It's easy to frame this as a tragedy, a cultural rupture, the severing of a link that had once allowed migration, exchange, and kinship across a unified land. But maybe it's better thought of as a transformation, not a falling off, but a floating free. Because islands do something to identity. They isolate, yes, but they also concentrate. They incubate myth. They turn distance into meaning. Once you can no longer walk to your neighbors, you start to imagine them differently, sometimes as strangers, sometimes as stories, sometimes both. The people of early Britain became something new, not because they changed, but because the land changed around them. The forests turned to coasts, the trails turned to tides, and what had once been a shared hunting ground became a memory under the waves. And that memory didn't disappear all at once. Some legends hint at lands lost to the sea, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐿 in Wales, Lioness off Cornwall, Atlantis, if we want to stretch the metaphor across cultures. But Doggerland left behind no myths we can verify. Its stories drowned with it. And in their place, we've constructed a modern mythology, a forensic one, a scientific one, pieced together from sediment cores, pollen grains, and the shape of the seafloor. We have learned to remember it not with poems, but with data. And yet the pull is the same, the ache of something familiar just beyond the edge of the map. The irony is hard to miss. Today, parts of that same seafloor are being paved with wind turbines, energy farms on top of fossil silence, progress floating over prehistory. We use the wind of the North Sea to power our screens and cities, unaware that every spinning blade casts a shadow over a forgotten trail. There's something poetic about that, or dystopian, or maybe both. But perhaps that duality is the point. Doggerland teaches us that loss and continuity are not opposites. They are siblings. They walk together, always. And if we stretch our gaze forward into the geological future, the separation continues. Britain drifts a few centimeters farther from Europe every year. The Atlantic spreads. The crust shifts. Maybe one day it will drift so far it becomes unrecognizable, not just politically, but literally. A lonely scrap of rock looking back across a sea that was once a forest. That, too, would be a kind of Brexit. One carved not by referendum, but by rift. But let's return to the present, to now, to the quiet facts. Doggerland was not a single place. It was an evolving landscape, a process more than a point. And in many ways, its final gift to us is perspective. The reminder that land itself is impermanent, that belonging is not fixed, that the borders we draw on maps today are shallow scratches on a restless planet. We are, all of us, descendants of wanderers, of people who walked across floodplains, who followed rivers inland, who camped on shores that no longer exist. We carry in our bodies the memory of movement, in our bones, the echo of vanished lands. Doggerland is not just beneath the North Sea, it's in our lineage, in our landscapes, in the way we imagine where we come from, and what it means to be home. So maybe it is fitting that Britain drifted away. not as an act of isolation, but as a geological footnote, a reminder that separation is never absolute, that what once connected us still echoes beneath the waves, and that sometimes the deepest stories are told by the land itself. Doggerland walked away slowly. Britain followed, and now we listen to the silence in between. Stay curious, stay calm, and somewhere, beneath the wind, the bones, and the silt, the land remembers.